Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. Welcome. I'm one of my writers today, David. Thank you, David's written me an episode, Bonnie and Clyde, Lovers, Outlaws, Morons. Never read it before, that's the format of the show. We're going to explore it together, dear listener, dear viewer. If you're watching on YouTube, let's jump in, shall we? And speaking of listening, if you want to rate the show on Spotify, that'd be greatly appreciated. I see we got tens of thousands of ratings, which is amazing. Thank you all. It was the morning of the 1st of April 1934, Easter Sunday, when the Barrow gang rolled into Dallas, Texas. Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker wanted to visit their families, but the cops were surveilling their home. They were hoping that the Barrow gang would arrive at some point for a visit so they could fill the Outlaws full of bullets. Classic policing in the past. It's like, what are we hoping for? Civil arrests? No. We're just going to pop them full of lead. Instead, the Barrow gang drove on for another 25 miles toward the small town of Grapevine. There, they were in a Ford V8. It was stolen, of course. 4 people were in the car. Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, Henry Methvin, and Joe Palmer. They stopped on Dove Road, just outside of Grapevine, surrounded by farmers' fields and roughly 100 meters from Highway 114. Clyde told Joe Palmer to get out, walk over to the highway, and hitchhike back to Dallas. Palmer would not be recognized by the cops, so he'd be able to pass a message on to the Parker and Barrow families that Bonnie and Clyde were outside of Grapevine, and they were waiting to meet them at a rendezvous point on Dove Road for a little holiday reunion. Palmer departed immediately. Traffic on Highway 114 was sparse on Easter Sunday, and it would probably take a long time for him to thumb his way back to Dallas. And so, Bonnie, Clyde, and Henry Methvin waited. Bonnie Parker got out of the car and began playing with a rabbit that she'd bought and named Sonny Boy. It was an Easter present for like a real rabbit? Just on a road trip? What, you got a rabbit? Just play? Okay. It was an Easter present for her mother, Emma. At the time, don't give people pets as gifts. That's crazy. You're not giving someone a gift. You're giving someone an obligation. At the time, Bonnie was 23 years old. A tiny waif of a woman, only 4'11" and rail thin at 90 pounds or 40 kilos. She was stylishly dressed and had strawberry blonde hair. She smiled and laughed easily, but she walked with a newly acquired limp. Eventually, Bonnie got bored of playing with the rabbit and fished out a bottle of whiskey. She goaded Henry Methvin, a sullen and paranoid escaped convict, into drinking with her. They took swigs straight out of the bottle as Bonnie talked aimlessly and quickly got faced. Conversely, Henry Methvin was a mean drunk, and the booze only served to make him more sullen. What is going on? You just chilling by the side of the road, playing with a rabbit while, on a drive, getting drunk out of your minds. Just before we continue with today's episode, let me thank the absolute goat of sponsors, and that would be my friends over at Vessi. Vessi make the most comfortable, the most stylish, the most waterproof shoes that you will ever buy. They're not water resistant, they're waterproof thanks to something called Dymatex, which is basically this material. Like, you wet this, the water just falls off it. These are the Stormburst. These are grey ones that I just got. I've been wearing a pair of... By the way, I've got a pair of white ones, and I was like walking around in the mud this weekend in them, and I was like, oh no. I went to like a petting zoo with my kids. And we all go in there, and I'm like, I've worn the incorrect shoes. I've not worn the right shoes, like these bright white, immaculate pair of Vessis. And they're getting all mudded up, and I'm like, oh, for God's sake, this is not good. Before we get in the car, grab the wet wipes. I got kids, wet wipes, standard equipment. I grab a few, and I just wipe the dirt off. Just wipe it off. I didn't even need to use water, and it was perfectly clean and white. And I don't have them with me today, so I can't show you that. But they're identical to these. Just imagine them in white. They look awesome. These ones... look at that. See that? I wore these shoes pretty much constantly for 2 and a bit years. And you can see that. I liked these so much that, they're shoes. You wear them pretty much every day straight for 2 years. They're going to get a little bit worn down on the bottom. I like them so much. I got a brand new pair of exactly the same shoes. These I think they were the first Vessis. What are they called? The Weekend. Yeah, these are great. Get these. Get the Stormburst. There's also the Boardwalks. They also do gloves. You can touch your smart devices with these. They're perfect. They're comfortable. Everything you need. They also have... got it right here. This is the Overcast jacket. It feels nice. It doesn't feel like some waterproof. You know, like some waterproof jackets feel all plasticky. This just feels great, and it's 100% waterproof. It's Vessi. You really can't go wrong. It's all I wear. I don't wear anything else. I mean, I wear other clothes because they don't make all the clothes that I need, but if they did, I would just wear those. For shoes, for jackets, for gloves, vessi.com/TCC. You'll get 15% off your first order at checkout. Really can't recommend it enough. And back to today's episode. Clyde Barrow did not partake in the whiskey. He wanted to stay sober in case there was any trouble. Also, someone's got to drive. I know this was the past. They probably just didn't have drink driving laws. They're like, no, that's cool. Just drink and drive. Like in Mad Men. It's the funniest scene. Like, just how the past was. And that was only the 1960s. Where, what's his face? Don Draper and the boss man with the white hair. They're having dinner at Don Draper's house. And he gets super drunk, the dude with white hair. Oh, what the f*** is his name? It doesn't matter. Anyway, the dude with white hair leaves. And he's clearly drunk. And you're just like, oh, how's he going to go? Of course he's going to drive. It's the 1960s. And he walks out the house and there's like a bang. And Don Draper just shouts to him, "That's my car. Yours is the other one." So then that guy's just going to drive home and he doesn't even know what car is his. Oh, the past. He needs to be able to drive quickly and shoot straight. Clyde was then 24 years old. He had thick brown hair and was dressed in an ill-fitting suit. Definitely less stylish than Bonnie, but he made an effort. Clyde was 5'6", 125 pounds or 56 kilos. Whoa, both these people are really small. 56 kilos? He was still quite young and not physically imposing at all. No, 5'6" and 56 kilos. There's nothing physically imposing about him. Yet his time inside the Texas prison system had turned him into an embittered, angry, and ruthless killer. Well, holy shit, okay. He bludgeoned to death a man nearly twice his size. He'd also proven himself to be quite the capable gunman. Yeah, there's no making up for psycho. Like, you can be short and thin, and you can be fighting someone, but if you're an absolute psycho, you can still win that fight. He was dauntless under fear, even when vastly outnumbered, even with well-armed veteran policemen as his adversaries. With a weapon in his hands, there was no denying that he was a force to be reckoned with, which is why the cops had given up trying to capture him and just wanted him dead. Clyde half listened to Bonnie natter on while she got progressively pissed. Meanwhile, he kept constant vigil of the traffic on Highway 114, looking for cops. But as the hours wore on, Clyde decided that there wasn't going to be any danger, so he laid down in the back seat of the Ford and had a nap. Bonnie polished off the bottle of whiskey and began chewing on slices of lemon peel to cover the smell of liquor on her breath. She didn't want her mother to know that she had been drinking. Yo, Bonnie, you polish off a bottle of whiskey, people are going to know. And it's not just coming out of your breath. It's like it sweats out of your body. Like, you can eat all the... Which is always like surprised. Like, I don't work in an office, but I feel like if I worked in a large enough office, you'd know if someone was an alcoholic, because you'd be like, it's not like the smell of whiskey. It's the smell of like that sweated alcohol. Like, you know, when you're like on the underground or something, and like someone's clearly had a bit of a rough night and they're just going home while you're going to work or whatever, and you're just like, oh, rough night, was it? Because you can smell the liquor on them. She stretched out languidly on the front seat and got some sleep in order to sober up. Henry Methvin was left standing watch. He had only busted out of prison a few months earlier. There's no way in hell he was going to sleep. He viewed every car that passed down the highway as a potential threat. Meanwhile, at approximately 1:30 p.m., Joe Palmer arrived back in Dallas. He made his way to the house of Henry Barrow, Clyde's father. He was the only one at home. Clyde's mother was out at church, and his siblings were out at other people's houses, sleeping off hangovers. Wait, so funny. He's just getting super faced in the morning, just drinking a bottle of whiskey in the morning. Okay, then. Palmer told Henry Barrow about the rendezvous point on Dove Road. Then Palmer headed over to the house of Emma Parker, Bonnie's mother, and told her the same. I hate drinking in the day. Like, when I was a kid, me and my mates would sometimes go to this. It was a nightclub in London, except it was in the day. It was called The Church. There's enough people listening to this. I'm sure some people listening have been to The Church. It was in an old church. In fact, it wasn't. It used to be in an old church, but then they got kicked out of the old church and they went to an old theatre. So it was in an old theatre. It was basically a club that just ran from like 9 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I have no idea why we thought this was a good idea. I probably just tagged along on someone else's thinking it's a good idea. But you just get drunk in the morning. And then you'd have to go home and it'd be like lunchtime and you'd be like, oh no. And no doubt, like, one of the group will get super faced and it'd be like, oh God, he's lying down on the train just on the floor on the way home. And you're like, oh no, Jim, no. Den Palmer headed over to the house of Emma Parker, Bonnie's mother, and told her the same. The police patrols, watching the Parker and Barrow residence, saw Joe Palmer, but did not attempt to detain him. Bonnie and Clyde had messengers contacting their parents all the time, and intercepting them accomplished little or nothing. The Barrow gang were seen as folk heroes among the poor of Dallas, Texas, along with many depression-stricken families in the rest of the country. The Barrow gang enjoyed fierce loyalty from their messengers. They never gave up a thing. Back in Grapevine, at approximately 3:30 p.m., 3 Texas Highway Patrol officers on motorcycles struck out along Highway 114. They were Senior Police Officer Polly Ivy and Junior Officers Edward Wheeler and Holloway Murphy. It was Murphy's first day on the job. He was 24 years old. Cruising down the 114, Wheeler spotted the Ford V8 100 meters off the highway on Dove Road. Wheeler turned off the next intersection and waved at Murphy to follow him. Senior Officer Ivy drove on, oblivious, not noticing the junior officers were no longer behind him. In 1934, the officers did not have radios on their bikes. Officer Wheeler suspected that the Ford V8 may have broken down and decided to pull over to see if the driver needed assistance. Wheeler was only 2 years older than Murphy, but he had some experience on highway patrol, and so he had wanted to show Murphy a routine stop and check. Ivy wasn't needed. They'd catch him up later. The 2 patrol officers pulled up to the car on Dove Road, and Wheeler dismounted while Murphy watched from his saddle. Wheeler left his shotgun on his bike. Murphy's shotgun, meanwhile, wasn't even loaded. Clyde sat up in the back seat and surreptitiously gripped his own shotgun, which lay next to him. He whispered to Henry Methvin, "Let's take them." This seems like a mistake. You've just, at the side of the road, someone eventually, like Highway Patrol or someone, is going to stop and be like, "You all right?" And then they'll be like, "Oh my God, it's that Clyde guy, get him!" Why wouldn't you just pull off on a smaller side road or something? Or like park your car in a bush? A drunken Henry Methvin didn't need any further encouragement and immediately raised a Browning automatic rifle, a hideously powerful World War I fully automatic machine gun. That shit's legal? Was that legal back in that, just having a machine gun? Methvin began firing. He hit Edward Wheeler with several armor-piercing bullets, shredding through his torso and killing him instantly. The panic-stricken rookie, Holloway Murphy, scrabbled in his pocket to grab some shotgun shells and load his weapon, but before he could do, Clyde Barrow leveled his own shotgun at him and shot Murphy square in the chest. The shotgun blast sent Murphy flying off the seat of his motorbike. 2 witnesses in a car, Mr. and Mrs. Giggle, screeched to a halt on the intersection on Highway 114 and watched in horror as Henry Methvin walked over to Murphy as the young man lay wounded on the ground. Methvin fired another shot into Murphy in an attempt to kill him, but Murphy still did not die. Mr. and Mrs. Giggle, what are you doing? If I saw this, I'd be like, drive on, find somewhere to call the police. It's like, what are you going to do? It's a shootout. A third witness, William Schaefer, who owned the farm off of Dove Road, claimed that as he sat on his porch, he saw Bonnie Parker, cigar clenched between her teeth, holding a rabbit in one hand and a pistol in the other, limp over towards Murphy, raise the pistol, and shoot him several times in the torso, so that in his convulsions, Murphy's head bounced off the ground, quote, like it was a rubber ball. Meanwhile, a few miles down Highway 114, Senior Officer Polk Ivy realized his 2 junior colleagues were no longer behind him. He doubled back and saw their 2 motorbikes on Dove Road, and shortly thereafter spotted the bodies of the 2 officers on the ground. The Ford V8 was nowhere to be seen. Ivy pulled up, dismounted, and examined the corpse of Officer Wheeler and the unconscious, blood-soaked body of Officer Murphy. Officer Murphy survives. Wasn't this like the 1940s? And he's been shot multiple times? How on earth is he surviving this? The 24-year-old Murphy was rushed to hospital where he's pronounced dead upon arrival. Okay, never mind. He's not surviving it because, yeah, of course he's not. It's the past and he got shot many times. After talking to the witnesses, everything soon became clear. The news was blasted across the United States. Bonnie and Clyde had struck again. For some reason in my head, Bonnie and Clyde were bank robbers, not murderers. Because they're like, aren't they like semi-romanticized for some reason? Although I know that can be for murderers as well, which is weird. But, yeah, I guess I don't know that much about this. Meet Bonnie Parker. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born October 1st, 1910, in the unincorporated rural community of Rowena, Texas. Her father, Charles Parker, was a bricklayer. Her mother, Emma Parker, was a housewife and a Baptist church-going country socialite whose days were filled with gossip, bake sales, box socials, charity drives, visit to neighbors, and hosting modest little dinner parties. Bonnie had a brother, 2 years older than her, named Hubert, and nicknamed Buster, and a sister, 3 years younger, named Billie Jean. Due to Bonnie's strawberry blonde curls and outgoing nature, she was considered an adorable little cherub as a child and was a favorite in the children's choir at church. For her part, the young Bonnie loved being the center of attention. She always enjoyed special treatment. In 1913, Bonnie learned to swear from an uncle and addressed her father with some foul language. If her brother Hubert had done that, he would have been beaten black and blue, but Charles could never bring himself to lay a hand on his darling little angel. Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to ever say that, like, hitting your kids is okay, or, like, literally beating your kids black and blue. Obviously not. But, like, it's hard. It's like, would I hit a man if necessary? Yes. Would I hit a woman if necessary? No. Even if it was necessary. Would I hit a woman? Well, only if it was necessary. No. It feels different. It feels different hitting, like, a woman or a girl. Like, you know. Everything changed in December 1914 when Charles Parker dropped dead of an unspecified illness. Bonnie was just 4 years old. Emma Parker was now a single mother with no means of supporting her children in Rowena. So she picked up sticks and moved back to her parents' place in Cement City, then an impoverished industrial town on the outskirts of Dallas. Emma's grandfather, Frank, was a mill worker who didn't make enough to support his daughter and 3 grandchildren, so was forced to take a job as a seamstress in a clothing factory. She earned sweatshop wages, roughly $9.50 a week. Bruh. Or $307 a week in modern money, which adds up to a little under $16,000 per year in today's currency. I mean, that's bad. But is that like sweatshop level? I get the feeling in a sweatshop, it's like it's like, I don't know, isn't it like they get paid like $1 a day or something horrific? While Emma was at the factory, her children were effectively raised by their grandmother Mary. While Buster and Billie Jean were well behaved, Bonnie was apparently a little shitter, as my father used to call such kids, a cutie from hell. It's a nice way of putting things. At age 5, Bonnie enjoyed setting small fires around the house and once raided her grandfather's wine collection, drinking until she passed out. Oh, Bonnie setting little fires. I mean, also, I'm a bit of a pyromaniac. Like, I love burning things. But I don't set fires. Set fires is like, you're hoping that it's going to burn down. I'd more like, me and my mates would go out into the forest, would build a fire, and then we'd throw like deodorant cans in there and watch them explode from behind trees because bang! But kind of that sort of pyromania. It's probably not what pyromania is. Just loved burning it. Whenever I go camping with my mates, we're like, should we build a fire? Should we build it as absolutely big as possible? And usually everyone's like, yeah. When Bonnie entered school, she continued to misbehave, stealing, bullying, and frequently resorting to physical violence with other girls and sometimes even boys who angered her. She was nevertheless popular and pretty and became one of the mean girls of Cement City. Boys were trying to quote-unquote date her before any of them had even hit puberty. Bonnie was thus the frequent recipient of small gifts from the little boys of her school. They'd use their precious pocket money to buy her candy and chewing gum. As Bonnie entered her teenage years in the 1920s, she dreamed of being a famous singer on Broadway or a Hollywood actress. She adopted the flapper style as soon as she could scrape together the money for the clothing and hairdo. She wore heavy makeup, all of which was quite scandalous in Texas at the time. At age 15, she even shelled out a premium to have a photo shoot so that she could use the glamour shots to kickstart a modeling career. Bonnie also dreamed of becoming a famous poet and filled volumes with witty if somewhat superficial and shallow rhyming verses. None of these dreams eventuated, not least because she lived in Cement City rather than Los Angeles or New York where she could be discovered, so Bonnie turned her attentions to at least marrying well, to find a man who was going places and could support her, shall we say, aspirational lifestyle. That's when, at age 15, she met Roy Thornton, a tall, charismatic, good-looking 17-year-old bad boy who always seemed to have money. In short, Roy Thornton was a total Chad. However, little did Bonnie know he paid for their dates with stolen cash. Bonnie was so infatuated that she got a tattoo of her and Roy's names in love hearts salaciously placed on the inside of her upper right thigh. Oh my god, I feel like that would be salacious today. This is like the 1940s. 1930s? Oh, 1920s, I'm sorry. Bonnie and Roy had only known each other a few months when they dropped out of school and got married on the 26th of September 1926, 6 days before Bonnie's 16th birthday. Wow, the past, that was allowed? Okay. They moved into a house near her grandparents and her mother's place. Unbeknownst to Bonnie, Roy Thornton supported them with the proceeds of thefts and general thuggery. The 16-year-old Bonnie was eager to have a baby, but for unknown reasons was physically incapable of having children. Bonnie missed her mother terribly, and on a daily basis either went over to visit Emma or begged her mother to spend the night at her and Roy's. Eventually, Roy and Bonnie just wound up moving in with Bonnie's mother, sister, and grandparents. It saved money, and it gave Bonnie what she wanted. I don't know if I'll be happy with that. It's like, but I spent so... Oh, they're very young though, aren't they? It'd be just weird to move in with your parents, like when you're older and married and stuff. I'd just be like, oh no, no. I love my parents, but I wouldn't want to live with them. After a year of this, in late 1927, the now 18-year-old Roy grew weary of Bonnie and her family. She had completely checked out of the marriage. He started drinking heavily, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time. When he returned, Bonnie and Roy would argue, and Roy would start in on beating her. Bonnie was heartbroken and suspected Roy was cheating on her during his disappearances. Bonnie distracted herself by going to the movies with friends and, like her spouse, regularly getting as drunk as a hobo's fart. In January 1928, when Roy was off on another bender, 17-year-old Bonnie began dating other men. But according to her diary, her heart wasn't in it, and she was still fixated on her darling Roy. Her darling Roy, who doesn't seem to be into this marriage at all. How did David describe it? Completely checked out and drinks heavily, goes away for weeks at a time. Why? He sounds like a douchebag. At the end of January, Bonnie got a job waitressing at a cafe several miles away from Dallas. Her salary was approximately $4 a week, or $72 in modern money. Horrendously low, but being good-looking and always flirtatious, she made a killing in tips from her more simp-like customers. I love applying this modern-day language, chat, simp-like, to historical stuff. It's fun. Her expenditure on clothing far exceeded her income, despite the fact that she paid no rent and had no children of her own to support. Thus, historians are fairly certain that Bonnie was also working as a hooker in Dallas. Her inability to get pregnant certainly reduced some of the risks of that profession, though the substantial risk of getting the clap or being smacked around by a customer was always a danger. Roy Thornton returned to Cement City a year later, in January 1929, after being gone for over a year. It's like, honey, I'm home. It's like, where the f*** you been, Roy? By that point, Bonnie was over him and probably told Roy to sling his hook. He did so. A few months later, he got arrested for robbery and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Bonnie never saw him again. But she did not bother to file for divorce and continued to wear his wedding ring, stating, quote, "I would be wrong to kick a man while he's down." Really? He seemed to be pretty into kicking you while he was up. Even as the years went by, Bonnie never bothered to divorce him, so she technically remained Mrs. Bonnie Thornton rather than Bonnie Parker until her dying day. In spring 1929, Bonnie got a job waitressing at Marco's, a well-to-do restaurant in Dallas that catered to lawyers, judges, bankers and the like. The flirtations continued. The tips got even bigger. If Bonnie was working as a prostitute at the time, as she likely was, her income must have increased by leaps and bounds. One of the less well-to-do customers at Marco's was a postal worker, Ted Hinton, who grew infatuated with Bonnie and attended the restaurant religiously despite the large expense, simply for the pleasure of chatting to her. Ted Hinton will factor into our story later again. Ted Hinton simping hard. Meanwhile, Bonnie came close to getting fired from Marco's several times because she kept giving food away to poor people. Less flatteringly, there's evidence these poor people were actually just her friends trying to score a free meal. Then, due to the Wall Street crash in the autumn of 1929, Marco's was forced to shut its doors and 19-year-old Bonnie found herself out of work. All the other waitressing jobs dried up. Bonnie could only find odd jobs as a babysitter or a cleaning maid in Cement City, and she no longer had an excuse to discreetly go off to Dallas to have sex for money. She certainly couldn't risk her church-going mother finding out by brazenly going off to hook anyway. Sex work in Cement City wasn't an option because most people in town knew her. And so, Bonnie was broke and depressed. Also, her dreams of fame and fortune appeared to be going nowhere fast. For a change of scenery, Bonnie moved in with a female friend in Cement City. Her friend had broken her arm, and Bonnie acted as a makeshift nurse. Meanwhile, Bonnie's brother Buster got married to a woman named Edith Clay. On January the 50th, 1930, the newlyweds threw a party at the house of Buster's brother-in-law, Clarence Clay. Bonnie attended and was introduced to a young man who was a friend of Clarence's. He wasn't as tall as Roy Thornton, nor as good-looking, and he would certainly not qualify today as a typical Chad. But there was something assertive and confident about him. He seemed cool and collected, the leader of all his friends, always in control, and better still, he had an air of danger, of mystery, menace. He drove an expensive car that was probably stolen. Bonnie was immediately smitten. Bonnie likes those bad boys. And so began history's most classic case of hybristophilia, otherwise known for obvious reasons as Bonnie and Clyde syndrome. And speaking of paraphilias and animalistic sexual attraction, Simon, please plug my book. Okay, David, you got it. Some might say our book, David, because my name's on the cover as well. It's not a book. I just wrote the foreword. But it was nice of David to offer this. It's like, look, it's a real book. It's in bookstores and everything. It's called Sex, 2 Billion Years of Procreation and Recreation. It has a different name elsewhere. This is the Australian version. I think it's called A Complete History of Sex or something elsewhere. It's not in the notes, but I'm sure there'll be a link below, or I'm sure you can easily find it because it's written by David Baker. It's a fantastic book. Obviously, I wrote the foreword, so I read it, the whole thing. And it's It's like, well done, Simon. You read the whole thing. A book you were writing the forward for. Well done. It's a fantastic book. I think you should buy it. And so does David. And it's quite new. But I'm sure all the reviews are brilliant. So enjoy it. Pick it up. That's all. Thanks, David. Or thank me, I guess. I don't know. Is there even a quote from me on the front? Sick. Sure to enlighten and entertain and challenge our understanding of human sexuality. Boom! Makes me even sound like an expert on human sexuality, which I'm not. I mean, I read the book. So maybe. Meet Clyde Barrow. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March the 24th, 1910, and not, as Wikipedia says, 1909. Oh, Wikipedia, no! On a farm southeast of Dallas. His father, Henry Barrow, had met his mother, Kumi Walker, in 1890, while they were both teenagers, and Henry was working at a sawmill to save up enough money to start a farm. Both came from religious and hardworking Texas families, though Kumi's family were religious to the extreme. They married on December the 5th, 1891. Henry rented a few acres and began to farm cotton. The couple had 4 children between 1894 and 1905, 2 sons, 2 daughters, Elvin, Artie, a girl, Ivan, and Nell. I like the name Artie. I think I mentioned previously I like the name Art. Neither of my kids are called Artie or Art, but now I'm like, maybe we should have called one of them Artie. It's a nice name. Clyde Barrow was followed 5 years later, in 1910, when Kumi was 36. 2 more siblings came after him. A boy named LC, that was his full name. It's just LC, like, it looks like initials, but that was the full name they chose for him. Interesting. I sign my emails off S, and I don't know why. I think at some point I was like, I'm just not going to type out my full name after sending every email. So I just type S. Like, obviously, first emails, I'll be more formal. But then after that, I just sign it off as S. And some people email me back, be like, hey, S. And I'm like, hey. It's not my name. But I signed off my email, so I understand where that came from. Elsie was born in 1913 when Kumi was 39, and a girl named Marie in 1918 when Kumi was 44. Wow, this is 100 years ago. 44? I mean, nowadays, yeah, of course, like IVF and all of that stuff. But that's old back in the day. An impressive run in the days before in vitro or fertility treatments, yes. Growing up, Clyde's nickname was Bud. A lot of his siblings had nicknames. His brother Ivan was called Buck, and his brother LC drew the short straw twice, being nicknamed Flop. Oh, God. Henry Barrow, did that mean what it was? That's like a failure. Henry Barrow struggled to turn a profit with his farming, and it seemed impossible that he'd ever be able to save up enough money to stop renting land and buy a farm of his own. And he had 7 children to support, though the eldest ones were soon old enough to help out on the farm. They were a dirt-poor farming family by any metric. Food was a luxury. Hunger was common. They slept on pallets on the floor of a 3-room shack. They did not have running water or electricity. Kumi insisted that all her children get an education so that they could ascend to better things. They all did, at least 6 years at school. Kumi was also the harsh disciplinarian of the family and employed corporal punishment frequently. Henry Barrow, on the other hand, did not like to beat his children, and he left the task to his wife. The children apparently did not resent Kumi for this, and all of them retained an ostensibly close and loving relationship with their mother for life. As a child, Clyde Barrow was intelligent and did well at school, but it bored him. He cut class semi-regularly. He occasionally enjoyed stealing roosters just for the fun of it. It's like stealing roosters. It does sound kind of fun, because like if you go into like a chicken pen and there's a rooster in there, that motherfucker's gonna like he's gonna be sneaky. Catching him's gonna be hard. Kind of want to go stealing roosters now. Clyde did, however, enjoy attending church, much to Kumi's great delight. Clyde displayed a dominant personality, bossing around his siblings. The younger ones, Elsie and Marie, followed his orders without question, but Clyde also wielded unfaltering authority over his older brother Ivan and his older sister Nell, despite their being 7 and 5 years older than him, respectively. Wow, okay. This guy's authoritarian. The exceptions were Clyde's eldest siblings, Elvin and Artie, who were already teenagers when Clyde was born and departed the farm before Clyde began stringing sentences together. The rest, however, marched to Clyde's tune. I have to say, like, my youngest son, who's 2, does sometimes too. He can barely speak. He can string like 3 or 4 words together, and he still manages to boss around my daughter, who's 2 years older than him. The rest, however, marched to Clyde's tune. Speaking of which, Clyde also turned out to be a talented guitar player and dancer, and to keep the family entertained on quiet evenings in the farmhouse. Also, as a young boy in Texas, Clyde developed a fondness for guns, target practice, and he became an incredibly good shot. Clyde did not, however, enjoy hunting and only did it out of necessity when the family required additional food. Yeah, I really like shooting. Like, I'd go shooting all the time as a kid. Like, I had a little air rifle at home, and basically, like, we lived in the middle of nowhere. I'll just be out for 9 weeks of summer holidays. Every day I'll be out in the garden for at least an hour, just shooting stuff in the garden, go through like hundreds of little pellets. And then we had a shooting range at school. And when I was old enough, I'd go there shooting like every day after school. Got quite good at shooting. Enjoy shooting. Never been hunting. Don't really have any desire to go out and shoot animals. That seems a bit mean. I like building the skill of shooting at targets. Clyde's relationship with his family was healthy, but his relationship with people in the wider community was a little more complicated. When it came to conflict with other young boys, Clyde tried to avoid fights. He tried to talk his way out. However, when violence became inevitable, Clyde was a savage fighter. Yeah, this is so far so good. I mean, he doesn't like killing animals, he likes shooting, and it's like, yeah, this is the right way to do things. If you're in a disagreement with someone, use words. And if words fail, use force. He'd also make sure to use any weapon that came to hand. Sticks, rocks, bottles, whatever. And he would not relent when his opponent gave up and cried for mercy. Again, it's kind of like, what's that thing? Always destroy your enemies, absolutely? Yes. Clyde would keep beating them until they had sustained serious injury. Occasionally, Clyde lost a fight. When he did, he bore a grudge, and he'd wait until he had an opportunity to attack and get his revenge. Forgiveness was not in his nature. Clyde's a bit of a badass. When the First World War ended in 1918, it signaled the start of a global recession that hit Texas farmers particularly hard. European agricultural goods, being absent for the past 4 years, flooded back into the market and eroded Henry Barrow's already meager profits. He took up a part-time job as a bricklayer to make ends meet. That wasn't enough. By 1922, the Barrow farm had to be abandoned. Henry's bricklaying left him with limited time to cultivate the cotton crops, and his eldest children had already migrated to the city. And he still had 12-year-old Clyde, 9-year-old Elsie, and 4-year-old Marie left to support. Thus, Henry and Kumi gave up farming, loaded their wagon, and migrated to Dallas. The Barrows settled in a squalid shantytown on the city's western edge. The place was known as the Devil's Back Porch because the poor from the camp would head over the river and steal things from the more prosperous citizens of Dallas. When the Barrow family first arrived at the camp, they didn't even have a tent, and so they had to sleep under their wagon. Henry Barrow didn't resort to thievery like some others, but instead he supported his family by going out every day to find scrap metal, which he sold at local foundries for an extremely limited reward. As such, in order not to starve to death, the Barrows were reliant on the Salvation Army, who came by the shantytown distributing food. Gradually, by scrimping and saving literally every penny, the Barrows were able to afford a tent, followed by the wooden planks, hammer, and nails Henry Barrow used to build a shack in the middle of the camp. Wow. This is 100 years ago. People were living in shacks in America. It's like the richest country although, people still live in tents and stuff. There's tent cities and stuff. It's like America's weird. It's like the richest country in the world, but there's so many poor people. Kumi spent her time looking after Elsie and Marie. Meanwhile, they frequently sent Clyde out to stay with his uncle Frank, Henry Barrow's brother, on his more prosperous farm in Corsicana in Texas. There, the 12-year-old Clyde played with his cousins, attended school, and helped out on his Uncle Frank's farm. And it spared Clyde the criminal temptations swirling around the Devil's Back Porch. When Clyde returned, he found the roguish nature of the porch quite entertaining and got along with most of the people there. As a rule, the thieves and miscreants in the Devil's Back Porch didn't steal from each other, since they had so little to steal, and focused their criminal activities across the river. One time, when Clyde was visiting, he came down with either malaria or yellow fever, a common occurrence in the porch. His father and younger sister got sick at the same time, and they all had to be hospitalized. According to Marie, Clyde charmed the nurses, and he became their favorite patient. The Barrow family's stay in the Devil's Back Porch stretched on for years, with the situation giving no sign of changing. Clyde spent most of his time at Uncle Frank's farm in Corsicana, but in 1925, when Clyde was 15, he decided that he would move to Dallas permanently to seek his fortune. His sleeping arrangements alternated between his parents' place in the porch and staying with his sister Nell and her new husband Leon, a factory worker and part-time musician. Clyde quickly befriended two Dallas lads, Clarence Clay and Clyde Jones. Being a skilled guitarist, Clyde wanted to become a professional musician. He also took saxophone lessons from Leon and soon became fairly proficient. Yeah, Clyde seems like one of these guys. He's very confident, he's very charismatic. He's like, yeah, I'll just go to a new city and make friends with people and just live with them. To have that level of charisma and social skills, pretty impressive. Kumi made Clyde promise to continue attending school, and so Clyde undertook a rather patchy attendance at Sydney Lanier High, but this only lasted a year. In 1926, at the age of 16, Clyde dropped out and got a factory job at the Brown Cracker and Candy Company for $7 a week, or $120 a week in modern money. This wage was not enough for Clyde, since he wanted to purchase some swanky clothes to attract girls. So he switched up to a 60-hour work week at the Procter & Gamble factory that earned him $18 a week, or $312 a week in present-day currency, which was better, but still nowhere near a living wage. Then Clyde sought another pay bump by working as a glazier at the United Glass Company, and soon after, he attempted to enlist in the US Navy. Clyde even got the letters USN tattooed on his arm, but he was rejected. So Clyde returned to earning a pittance at the glass factory. However, at that point, Clyde started supplementing his income with petty crimes. Here we go. Initially, Clyde took to stealing chickens from people's backyards, something that was still common in Dallas in 1926. You could sell a chicken for $1 or $2, or failing that, you'd be able to dispose of the evidence with a tasty meal. How much was he making a week? $18, and you could sell a chicken for $1, so it'd have to steal like 3 chickens a day to do better than what he was making at the company. That's crime does pay, doesn't it? Eventually, Clyde got caught and arrested, but he wasn't charged since chicken theft was extremely common and there weren't enough jail cells in Dallas to hold everybody who did it. Meanwhile, Clyde hooked up with a girl named Eleanor B. Williams. Apparently, she was a real knockout. Clyde tattooed her initials on his arm and spent a lot of his income buying her gifts. But, like with most teenage relationships, Clyde and Eleanor eventually fought. Eleanor went to stay with relatives in the town of Broadus for a few days to get away from him. Clyde rented a car to drive out to Broadus to wing her back. However, he attempted to save a couple of bucks on the rental fee by neglecting to mention that he was taking the car out of town. Clyde didn't return the car on time. Yeah, I've definitely done that. It's like, so where are you driving? Oh, just locally. Definitely not taking it across any country lines. Definitely wouldn't do that. And I know there are GPS trackers on them, so I guess you're only getting into trouble if you happen to have a crash in another country, and then they're like, yeah, you're going to owe us the whole value of the car for that one because the insurance didn't cover this country. Yeah, car rental. Don't rent cars to me. Kumi told them that Clyde was in Broadus, so the local sheriff was sent round to where Clyde was staying. Clyde hid in the attic while the sheriff grabbed the rental car and left. Clyde probably would have avoided legal trouble if he'd simply appeared, spoken to the sheriff, and paid the extra rental fees. Instead, on December 3rd, 1926, Clyde hitchhiked back to Dallas, where he was arrested for car theft. The rental company ultimately didn't press charges since they got the car back. But now, Clyde had a clear criminal record. Yeah, this is the problem, right? If you get a criminal record, then I don't know, it's been a very, very long time since I've applied for a job, but there's always the box, like, do you have a criminal record? And I bet checking that box, right, you're not getting that job. And then that kind of fucks up your life, because then you're going to have to go and do crimes to do stuff. Or I suppose you could start your own business. Like, I run my own business. I don't have a criminal record, fortunately, unless you count, like, speeding tickets. Parking tickets. I have many driving offences, but like all minor ones. Nothing serious. I haven't run over any pedestrians yet. Criminal records, that's trouble. Shortly thereafter, Clyde convinced Eleanor to elope with him. They left town again, but it soon became clear that Clyde had used the elopement as an excuse to convince Eleanor to have sex with him. She got angry and dumped him. In late December 1926, less than 3 weeks since his last arrest, Clyde was picked up by the cops with his older brother Ivan as they attempted to load a truck full of stolen Christmas turkeys. Ivan took... Such a strange thing to steal. Ivan took full responsibility for the crime, saying Clyde knew nothing, and he spent a week in jail. Clyde, meanwhile, had been arrested twice in a month, and this put him firmly on the radar of Dallas police. After that, the police frequently picked him up for questioning under suspicion of committing a robbery in the local area. Whenever a robbery occurred, Clyde was treated as one of the so-called usual suspects. Their suspicion was not without justification. In 1927, Clyde began stealing cars, hit hotwire one, file off the serial number on the engine, then drive it across state lines to sell it in Oklahoma. Each theft could net him $100 to $200, depending on the car's value. In other words, each car theft earned him $1,735 in modern money. That's not a bad gig. Meanwhile, it's a bad gig because you're going to end up in prison, like you're crossing state lines. I don't know much about American law, but in the movies it's, you cross state lines. That's a bad time. Meanwhile, Clyde kept up the pretense of legitimate employment, working at the Bama Pie factory, and soon after switching to the A&K paint shop. But the hourly wage was tiny compared to what Clyde could earn from car theft, so he eventually quit and became a full-time thief. Yeah, but you're not doing the job for the money. You're doing the job so you have something to, cover your actions. On February the 22nd, 1928, Clyde was hauled in for questioning for a car theft in Fort Worth, not far from Dallas, but had to be released because the cops couldn't find enough evidence that he had committed the crime. The common narrative that has sprung up about Clyde Barrow's criminal evolution at this time is, in a nutshell, that if he hadn't been so poor, and if police hadn't started harassing him after the rental car and the turkeys, he wouldn't have turned a full-time criminal career. I'm not so sure. It seems like he's pretty mercenary. He's like, oh yeah, look, stealing cars pays more than my job, so I quit my job. I think he's morally flexible enough to be a criminal, sees the rewards, and so pursues that. It doesn't matter if he'd got caught for stealing turkeys, he was going to pursue it anyway. I'm not sure that justification holds water. Yes, David and I, same page. Barrow wanted more money for fancy clothes and to impress women, not for survival. And I'm pretty sure getting fingered for petty theft doesn't justify robbing even more innocent people. But the much romanticized Bonnie and Clyde story requires a hero, and in order to do that, one needs to rationalize away a lot of their ill deeds. The problem is that it would only get far, far worse. Yeah, okay, so I thought there was romanticization around Bonnie and Clyde, but I digress. When Clyde Barrow wasn't stealing cars, he continued to be a ladies' man, hooking up with 3 girls named Anne, Grace, and Gladys, each of whom had their initials added as tattoos on his arms. It's weird, bro. You marking that notch on your bedstead on your arm with tattoos? Women in the future are going to be like,
who are all these people's initials?
Oh, nobody.
That's my credo. No regrets.
Gladys was particularly mercenary in her approach to Clyde, burning through the loot from his car thefts and even making him pay for a fancy resort vacation in Mexico. Clyde sent his sister Marie a postcard while he was down there with a message, drunk as hell, having fun with Gladys. Gladys dumped Kyle immediately after the holiday, having gotten what she wanted and being ready to move on to the next sucker with cash in his pocket. Clyde was more annoyed than he was heartbroken. In August 1928, Clyde started breaking and entering with a man named Frank Klaus, robbing homes and businesses when nobody was there. Clyde soon learned how to crack safes. He also brought in his brother Ivan to join the gang of burglars. Their criminal activities went undetected by police for over a year until in September of 1929, they were arrested under suspicion for planning to rob a safe at a lumber company. They were quickly released for lack of evidence. Yeah, suspicion for planning. It's like, that's not the strongest thing. Why not get him for one of the crimes that he's actually committed? But he was rearrested the next day under suspicion of some recent burglaries in the towns of Lufkin and Hillsborough. There we go, that's more sensible. Get him for the crimes that he's actually done. Again, due to limited evidence, he was released without charge. Okay, never mind, I take it all back. When the Wall Street crash started at the end of September, it barely affected the Barrow clan since Henry Barrow was a self-employed scrap collector. Ivan and Clyde were career criminals, and none of them kept their money in banks. Instead, when tragedy struck, it was of a different sort. On the night of November the 29th, 1929, Clyde, his brother Ivan, and another delinquent named Sidney Moore were riding in a stolen Buick, ready to run it out of town, when they spied a much more expensive Ford. They climbed in, hotwired it, and drove off, soon after spotting an upscale Dallas house that appeared to have nobody home. They broke in, but only managed to come away with a few pieces of jewelry and some petty cash. It was now 1 a.m. on the 30th. They drove from Dallas to the town of Denton looking for another score. They broke into a car garage, tried to crack a safe that was inside and failed. So they picked up the safe and lugged it out to the Ford. They were about to leave when 2 cops in a patrol car spotted them. Clyde slammed on the gas pedal and took off with the cops in hot pursuit. Yeah. Running from the cops is going to be like, boys, why is there a safe in the back? Could you open that up for us? To be like, no. Can't open it up, don't even know what's in it. We stole the safe. Clyde took a turn too fast and crashed the car, and so he, Ivan and Sidney were forced to take off on foot. That's when the cops started shooting. Ivan was hit in both legs and went down. Sidney got to his knees and surrendered. Clyde kept running and hid in the crawl space of a nearby house. He hitchhiked back to Dallas. Meanwhile, the stolen Ford contained the safe and the jewels. The latter were traced back to the house they burglarized and the Ford to its actual owner. The police had spotted the gang taking the safe from the garage, so no mystery there. But in an ironic twist, it had only contained $30, or about $540 in modern money. Ivan Barrow and Sidney Moore were charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering and larceny. Their trial was on December the 17th, and the jury took only a few minutes of deliberation before finding them guilty. Ivan and Sidney got 4 years in prison. But they didn't squeal on Clyde, who spent the rest of December hiding at his parents' house in the Devil's Back porch, afraid that the police might still pick him up in connection with the robberies that night, or in connection with the dozens of other robberies he had committed in Dallas and the surrounding townships. Wow, this guy's got good friends. They're just like, keep silent, don't tell them about Clyde. Don't get a deal. I'd be worried. It was only in the new year when Clyde ventured out again and bumped into his friend Clarence Clay, who invited him to a house party at his place on the 5th of January 1930. And it was there that Clyde met Bonnie Parker. Prison as an aphrodisiac. According to what Bonnie and Clyde later told their families, their attraction was apparently instant. Bonnie found Clyde confident, masterful, and a bit dangerous, which he is. All of these things. Clyde thought Bonnie was hot, unlike the fact that she was shorter than him. Previously, he had stood on road curbs to add a few extra inches of height when being photographed with his various girlfriends. Height was a sore spot with him. What they had in common were their delusions of grandeur. Both had grown up poor. Both felt entitled to a life of fancy clothes, fast cars, and constant partying. What connected them was their determination to achieve such a life. Bonnie stayed beside Clyde for the rest of the evening, laughing and talking. The next day, Clyde paid a visit to where Bonnie was staying with her friend with the broken arm. He found her making hot chocolate on the stove. It was probably then that they made love for the first time. Soon after, Bonnie moved back in with her mother, grandmother, and sister. Her brother, Buster, had married Edith Clay and moved out, and Bonnie's grandfather, Frank, had died. Meanwhile, Bonnie's sister, Billie Jean, had married. She and her husband were living in the Parker household, along with their newborn baby. Bonnie eagerly introduced Clyde to her family. Her mother, Emma, formed a favourable initial impression of him, and she was startled by how much Bonnie seemed to worship the ground that Clyde walked on. They continued to see each other practically every day for the next few weeks. Yeah, again, Clyde seems like, of course the mum likes him, because he's like super good at this stuff. Then, in early February 1930, Clyde came over to the Parker household to tell Bonnie that he'd be leaving town for a bit. Although Clyde had not yet confided in Bonnie about his criminal activities, he was going out of town to commit another series of robberies. Bonnie told Clyde that she'd miss him terribly and invited him to spend the night. Because the house was crowded with Bonnie's family, this didn't mean sex. Clyde slept on the couch. Bonnie just wanted to see as much of Clyde as possible before he left town. Oh, that's sweet. The next morning, the Dallas police showed up at the front door of the Parker household. They knocked. Clyde answered, and immediately they slapped him in cuffs and arrested him for multiple counts of grand larceny and grand theft auto in the towns of Denton and Waco, Texas. Oh no, the favourable impression of the mother is just left. In cuffs, Bonnie tried to cry, scream, and pound the wall with her fists, begging the police not to arrest him. Clyde told her everything was going to be all right, but Bonnie had flown into full-on hysterics. When the police left, Bonnie collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her mother tried to console her. Bonnie replied by vowing that she'd go stand by Clyde and wait for him no matter what. As for finding out that Clyde was a car thief and a burglar, this heightened rather than diminished Bonnie's attraction to him. Is this hybristophilia? Is this what we mentioned earlier? Like attraction to criminals? Oh, Bonnie, you've got that. Bonnie had always thirsted to live a life of glamour, and being shacked up with a dashing rogue had a glamour all of its own. Dashing rogue? Didn't we say that Clyde wasn't like super handsome? He's just like super charming. So dashing, it's just like, God, it's really about framing it, isn't it? Because she's with a dashing rogue who's got a few years in prison. It's like, nah, she just married a guy who stole cars. Or is like with a guy who stole cars and that's it. In fact, as we now know, Bonnie would get sexually aroused by Clyde's criminal behaviour. This is the essence of hybristophilia. Well, there we go. Thank you, David. I've briefly discussed hybristophilia in the video on Veronica Compton and the Hillside Strangler, along with covering it in my 2 billion year history of sex book. This would have been an even better place to plug the book, David, which you can pick up wherever you get your books. But briefly, hybristophilia is a fairly common paraphilia because it has a strong evolutionary origin. It's a reproductive strategy that prevailed in early Homo sapiens, and indeed in our ancestors millions of years before Homo sapiens even existed. So imagine this. You live in a Paleolithic forest 200,000 years ago. It's something I'm going to struggle to imagine, but okay. The murder rate among human hunter-gatherers at the time was estimated 10%. The fuck? 10% of deaths are murder? Good lord. No cops, no forensics, no judges, no juries. The only form of security is one's own family and the threat of a blood feud breaking out if anyone harms you. Social cooperation with the tribe and selecting a mate who does the same is one way to protect yourself and your children. That is the most common strategy among humans. Another is to hook up with predators, sociopaths, and ruthless criminal types who take what they want, when they want, and who are vicious enough to defend themselves in a harsh Paleolithic world. Hooking up with such a person is a valid reproductive strategy, provided the dark triad motherfucker didn't turn his aggression on you or your offspring. Instead, if his ruthlessness protects and provides for you and your offspring, your evolutionary reproductive gambit pays off. As such, the strong instinctual attraction to such people prevails to this very day. It's why people like Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, and even Jeffrey Dahmer, despite being gay, got hundreds of love letters and even marriage proposals from adoring Hebristophiles while they were in prison. Well, Jeffrey Dahmer could have got them from men, couldn't he? Can men not be Hebristophiles? I know it's mostly associated with women, but isn't that mostly because men go to prison? Hell, Ted Bundy even married and impregnated a woman while he was locked up. He fucking did? Ted Bundy had a kid while he was locked up for being Ted Bundy? Why? Did he? Ted Bundy should not have that thing. Conjugal visits. He should not have that. And serial killers are just the more extreme examples. Plenty of bikers, drug dealers, and mafia thugs have wives, girlfriends, or quote-unquote gangster moles who are more attracted to them for their criminal activities, not less. It's the attraction to the bad boy writ large, fetishized, exaggerated, and turned absolutely pathological. And it's why the more Bonnie learned about Clyde, and the worse his crimes got, the more she loved him. Most women would run a mile, but not the case with Hebristophile. Bonnie regularly visited Clyde in Dallas County Jail, and in between visits, she wrote him a series of extremely long love letters. The end of one such letter is revealing. "I'm so lonesome for you, dearest. Don't you wish we could be together? Sugar, I never knew I really cared for you until you got in jail." While Clyde was in prison, awaiting transfer to Denton, Bonnie took a trip over to the Devil's Back Porch in West Dallas to meet his family. Clyde's little sister Marie, then 12 years old, formed an immediate friendship with Bonnie. Clyde's mother, Kumi on the other hand, was decidedly unimpressed. She thought that Bonnie was a makeup-clad little harlot and gold digger. Digging for what gold? He's in prison for stealing. Not the sort of godly woman she envisioned for her son at all, but if Kumi let slip her animosity towards Bonnie, the latter didn't notice. She thought Clyde's family, including Kumi, were perfectly lovely. Clyde was transported to the town of Denton, where he stood before the grand jury for the robberies that he committed there with Ivan and Sydney Moore on the night of November the 29th. Multiple robberies, you're going to go to prison for a long-ass time. But also he's not, because we know he gets out, and because that's the story. But there wasn't enough evidence to indict him. Next, Clyde was transported to Waco, where the grand jury had enough evidence to indict him for multiple counts of grand theft auto and possession of stolen goods, which isn't quite robbery, so that's going to have a lighter sentence, right? Both Bonnie and Kumi traveled to Waco to support Clyde at his trial. Realizing he was facing a long prison sentence, on March 5, 1930, Clyde entered a plea of guilty. As a result, he was given the relatively lenient sentence of 2 years in prison. Well, that is pretty lenient for multiple grand theft auto. Clyde returned to Dallas after the sentencing. Meanwhile, Bonnie stayed on in Waco, determined to be there until the moment Clyde was finally transferred to Huntsville prison. But Clyde had no intention of going to Huntsville. On the morning of March the 11th, when Bonnie visited him at the jail in Waco, Clyde instructed her to get a gun and smuggle it to him when she visited again that evening. Oh my. Dude, you just got 2 years in prison. Just take the 2 years. If you attempt to break out of prison, they're going to throw you in there for a much longer time. Clyde would then use the gun to take a hostage or shoot his way out. Bro, of prison, you're going to get yourself killed. Bonnie obeyed, thinking it was terribly romantic. She got a gun and used a belt to strap it to her torso underneath her dress. The guards searched her purse when she returned that evening, but they didn't frisk her. When Bonnie was sat across from Clyde, she reached under her dress and quickly slipped Clyde the gun. She then left quickly afterward, as Clyde had instructed. Holy, she just smuggled a gun into prison. Clyde enlisted 2 other inmates in his jailbreak plan, William Turner and Emery Abernathy. At 7:30 that evening, Turner complained to a guard that he was sick. He asked for a glass of milk to settle his stomach. The guard complied. When the guard entered Turner's cell to hand him the milk, Turner pulled the gun on him, grabbed his keys, locked him in the cell, and then went to free Clyde and Abernathy. The 2 of them hurried toward the front of the jail, pointing the gun at the desk sergeant there. They told him to keep quiet for 5 minutes or they'd come back and shoot him. Then the trio walked out of the door onto the street, but then neglected to take the sergeant's own gun. He immediately got up, ran out the door, and opened fire. At this point, Abernathy had the smuggled gun. He shot back. Someone in the area heard the gunfire and called the cops. Police swarmed the scene minutes later. But Clyde and his compatriots had already made their escape. They'd broken into a parked car, Clyde had quickly hotwired it, and they'd driven off just before the cops arrived. They drove to the north side of Waco, jumped out of the car, and swapped it for another. They sped out of Waco, stealing a new car in every town they passed through, and then they got the hell out of Texas. Pretty smart, to be honest, switching the cars up so often. By March the 17th, 1930, they'd made it as far north as Ohio, where in the small country village of Middletown, they robbed a dry cleaners and a railway depot for $60 or $1,100 in modern money. They fled Middletown well after nightfall and got lost on the country roads. So they stopped and decided to get some sleep. The next day, still lost, they stupidly drove back into Middletown where the police were waiting for them. Oh no. He's getting arrested already? I know, jailbreaks don't typically last for very long, but this is very quick. When a patrol car gave chase, the trio abandoned the vehicle and tried to flee on foot. Turner and Abernathy were arrested within the hour. Clyde hid in the crawl space of a nearby house again. He emerged several hours later and stole another car. The cop spotted him. Clyde sped away and almost got out of Middletown when he made the mistake of turning into a dead-end street. He surrendered. Clyde, Turner, and Abernathy were transported back to Waco in chains on March the 21st. In punishment for his escape, 10 years were added to Clyde's sentence. Yeah, dude, you should have taken those 2 years. You got away with a lot. That 2 years was a great deal. And then you spent 1 day out of jail in an escape, and now you have to spend 12 years in prison instead of 2. That sucks. Meanwhile, Bonnie had spent a week in Waco after the jailbreak, hoping that Clyde would somehow send for her. Hearing nothing from him, she hitchhiked back to Cement City on March the 18th. After hearing of Clyde's capture, Bonnie did not go back to Waco to assist him in a second escape attempt, but not because her affections had cooled. Clyde was now being kept in a maximum security cell at the jail. Yeah, no surprise, he smuggled a gun into jail. Instead, Bonnie got another waitressing job in Dallas and decided to wait on events. She was eager for the next opportunity to communicate with Clyde and suitably heartbroken that they had been parted. She finally made her way down to Waco again on April the 19th, just before Clyde was due to be transferred out to Huntsville. She couldn't bear not seeing him. It should be noted, at this point, Bonnie had known Clyde for a whopping 4 months, 3 of which he'd spent in prison. Yeah, she's got that hebristophilia strong for Clyde. The mutilation of the soul. Clyde was shipped from Waco to Huntsville prison on April the 21st, 1930. During the intake procedure, he lied and said he was 18 instead of 20 in the hopes that he would get an easier time. He also lied that his middle name was Champion instead of Chestnut, hence the weird entry on Wikipedia. Lastly, he lied that he and Bonnie were married because inmates could only write letters to spouses and immediate family members. This is the past, right? You could just be like, how old are you? 18. And it's like... Nowadays, they'd be like, well, we looked it up, and that's not true. They don't even need to look it up. They don't even need to have you write it down. They know, because there's all the data.
Is wrong. Incorrect.
Clyde was not immediately assigned to a work detail. Instead, he sat in his cell, occasionally being shipped out to Houston and Waco, where further charges were deliberated upon by 2 grand juries. They were ultimately dropped without going to trial. Then in September 1930, Clyde found out that he'd been assigned to work in the cotton fields at Eastern Prison Farm, not far from Huntsville. This was the worst assignment anybody could get. It was back-breaking labor in the hot sun, while being beaten on a whim by sadistic guards. Usually it was reserved for the most hardened killers and repeat offenders, but Clyde's escape attempt had won him a spot on the list. On September the 18th, Clyde was put inside a prison van, shackled by the hands, feet, and neck, and taken out to Easton. The prison farm was divided into 2 camps, totaling 500 prisoners watched 24/7 by 60 armed guards, or roughly 1 guard for every 8 convicts. The guards were mounted on horses and were able to catch up with any convict who tried to escape. Clyde was forced to run up to 2 miles each day to start work in the cotton fields and then run 2 miles back. The convicts were not allowed to walk. They worked 10-hour days with 1 day off per week, except during harvest months, where they worked 7 days per week without respite. The food given to the convicts consisted of bread made from the same grain that fed livestock, the occasional plate of potatoes or spoonful of peas, a very rare bit of boiled meat, and bacon, which very often had turned rancid in its tin container. Boiled meat is that's just the grimmest way to cook meat. It's like how to make meat worse. Boil it. Clyde did not fare well at Easton. He was not built for such hard labor. The malnutrition didn't help, and he didn't have the good sense to avoid provoking the guards. He was frequently beaten, and it got so bad that fellow inmates began to speculate whether Clyde would even survive his 12-year sentence. Worsening the situation was an inmate named Ed Crowder, a convicted bootlegger and smuggler of alcohol during Prohibition, who was 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. That's 182 centimeters and 91 kilos. Ed Crowder regularly beat and forcibly sodomized Clyde Barrow. After these assaults, some of the other inmates would join Crowder in mocking Clyde, saying that the smaller man had probably enjoyed it. Clyde had to endure being sexually assaulted by Crowder for an entire year. While all of this was going on, Bonnie's affection for Clyde had faded. She was simply bored of waiting for him. Despite Bonnie and Clyde's relationship being treated as a story of true love today, it appears that Bonnie's love was quite opportunistic. She stopped writing Clyde at the end of December 1930 and began dating other men. As a result of these stresses, Clyde's mind was contorted beyond repair by his time at Eastham. He transformed from a hoodlum into a hardened criminal. He was becoming increasingly bitter and ruthless. He began to fantasize about returning to Eastham after his sentence with an armed posse. He wanted to murder all the guards and free the prisoners. Not that all prisoners were his friends. In 1930, Clyde deliberately dropped a tree he was chopping on another inmate who was an informer for the guards, severely wounding him. As for Ed Crowder, on October the 29th, 1931, Clyde got his hand on a lead pipe and ambushed Crowder in the showers, bludgeoning him in the head until Crowder's skull was cracked open in several places and brain matter had been strewn across the floor. Oh my God. Dude. You're now going to be in prison forever. Except we know you're not, so how's that happen? Another inmate, Aubrey Scally, who was serving a life sentence and who also hated Crowder, claimed responsibility so that Clyde didn't get a life sentence or the chair. As it turned out, Scally was able to convince a grand jury that he'd acted in self-defense. Crowder's reputation as a violent bastard preceded him. Yeah, seems like Crowder deserved to go. He kind of deserved that beating with a pipe. In January 1932, Clyde came to the conclusion that he would not survive another decade of hard labour in the cotton fields of Eastham Prison Farm. On January the 27th, Clyde used an axe to cut off the big toe and half of the second toe on his left foot. Or possibly Clyde may have had this amputation done for him by another inmate. It's unclear. Either way, this act got him out of the cotton fields of Eastham and sent to the prison hospital back in Huntsville. Once Clyde had recovered, he would be reassigned indoor work at Huntsville because the mutilation of his foot ensured that Clyde would never walk properly again. I mean, it's a big sacrifice to make, but I think after a while I'll be like, gotta make those big sacrifices. I don't want to be out in those cotton fields. It's really hot.
Take it off.
I don't like getting beaten by the guards all day. But it turns out that Clyde shouldn't have done this. Oh. Because a mere 6 days later, on February the 2nd, 1932, Clyde Barrow successfully petitioned Ross Sterling, the governor of Texas, to parole her son on the grounds that Clyde was a first-time offender, that he hadn't physically harmed anyone in his crimes, and he was young and foolish when he committed them. Wow, Kumi came around. I thought she didn't like him. The bit about being a first-time offender was technically true. Clyde had only been convicted in a court of law once, and nobody knew that Clyde had murdered Ed Crowder. As for his age, indeed, at the time of his parole, Clyde was not yet 22. Thus, Clyde was released. He returned home to Dallas, malnutritioned and on crutches, a thoroughly changed man. He vowed that he would never go back to prison ever again, but this didn't mean that Clyde intended to turn over a new leaf and go straight. It meant that he would never allow himself to be taken alive. Never piss off a crowd of Texans. While Clyde was in prison, his eldest siblings, Elvin, Artie, and Nell, helped their father purchase a couple of plots of land on Eagle Ford Road in West Dallas. Henry Barrow literally picked up his shack from the Devil's back porch, put it on a large wooden pallet, and carted it over to one of the plots. He struck a deal with an oil company and converted the shack into a gas station. 2 pumps were installed out front. Eagle Ford Road was a main thoroughfare, but actual sales of his gasoline did not earn much money. Henry supplemented his income by selling water from a well that he'd dug on the property, charging to use the gas station's telephone, and most importantly, selling homebrewed beer and moonshine to an inexhaustible supply of customers. Literally just drivers. Henry added an extra room to the shack to use as an office and for storage, added another room for a kitchen, and converted the front room into space to be used for the actual store. This left a bedroom where Henry and Kumi slept, and another room that functions as a living room during the day and sleeping quarters for their youngest kids, Elsie and Marie, at night. They were now teenagers, 19 and 14 respectively. Clyde's other sibling, Ivan, was also in Huntsville doing a 4-year stretch of his own for the Denton robberies of November 1929. When Clyde got out in February 1932, he joined Elsie and Marie in their living room/bedroom. Only a day or two after Clyde got out of prison, he hobbled over on his crutches to the Parker residence. He found Bonnie there in the sitting room with her then boyfriend, whose name's been lost to history. When Bonnie saw Clyde, she yelled, "Darling!" and ran to him, threw her arms around him and began kissing him passionately. Then boyfriend's like, "What the fuck's going on?" This effectively ended Bonnie's relationship with the other bloke. We don't know if the guy put up much of a fuss on his way out of the door. Savage. For Clyde's part, he didn't show any resentment for Bonnie cutting off communications and dating other dudes while he was on the inside. Their relationship simply reignited where they'd left off. Bonnie wanted to constantly be in Clyde's company, so she spent much of her time staying at the Barrow gas station, much to Kumi's displeasure. The Great Depression was still in full swing in 1932, so Clyde struggled to find a job. When he did find some low-paying, menial work, he didn't keep it long. Clyde alleged that this was because of police harassment. Apparently, the cops fell into their old habit of picking him up as a usual suspect, which put his employers off a bit. Well, Clyde, that's because you are the usual suspect, because you're a criminal who does lots of crimes. It's unclear whether this is actually true or if Clyde was just using it as an excuse. It is illuminating that Clyde's stint on the job market lasted less than a month. It's hard to say that he really made much of an effort. Then in March 1932, Clyde left Texas and went to Framingham, Massachusetts to work on a construction crew. The idea was for Bonnie to join him there once he was settled. But that scheme lasted a whopping 2 weeks before Clyde returned home. The popular narrative in the hero worship version of Clyde's story is that he wanted to go straight but was forced to a life of crime by the police and an unjust society. In reality, the bugger barely even tried. I mean, to be fair though, he does have a criminal record, which is going to make it super hard for him to get a regular-ass job. No sooner had Clyde returned from Massachusetts that he teamed up with a fellow convict from Eastham named Ralph Fultz and a local Dallas scumbag named Ray Hamilton to launch a series of smash-and-grab robberies across the US. At the time, Bonnie remained at her mother's place with the intention of joining her beloved Clyde later. This was the embryo of what would later be called the Barrow Gang, because Clyde was always the gang's deciding voice and ringleader. But at the time, the boys dubbed it the Lake Dallas Gang. Their first target was only a few blocks down the road from where Clyde's parents lived, the Sims Oil Refinery. They hit the place on March the 25th, 1932. Clyde hadn't even been out of prison 2 months. Armed with pistols, they broke into the place at night, tied up 4 employees who were still there, and cracked open the safe. Gore was inside. The gang fled the scene empty-handed. Over the next few days, the gang mugged a few people in Dallas at gunpoint in order to gain some travel money. Then they stole a car and drove 1,400 kilometers, that's 870 miles north, to the small town of Okabena in Minnesota. There they staked out a bank, but called it off because the ice and snow on the roads would make the car skid during the getaway. From there, they drove 640 kilometers, 400 miles south to Lawrence, Kansas, where they cased another bank. This time, the prospect looked good. After 3 days of scouting, they sprang into action. At 8:45 in the morning, the bank manager arrived and was immediately held up by Clyde and Fultz, brandishing shotguns. They forced him into the bank and got him to open the vault. Clyde handled the manager while Fultz did crowd control, ambushing and subduing 4 employees as they arrived for work. After Clyde grabbed the loot, they locked the manager and the employees in the vault and took off, with Ray Hamilton at the wheel. Then they got the hell out of Lawrence before the cops could be alerted and drove 460 kilometers or 290 miles to St. Louis, Illinois. Their take from the Kansas bank job was $33,000 or $740,000 in modern money. Holy shit. That's not bad, is it? Especially when you consider that, what was he making, like $8 a week or something terrible? From East St. Louis, they drove to the town of Dupo, Illinois, where they spent thousands of dollars buying a bunch of 45 caliber handguns, a dozen Thompson machine guns, a dozen bulletproof vests, and thousands of rounds of ammunition from a local fence, reinvesting those profits. It was at this point that Ray Hamilton got cold feet, took his share of the Kansas money, and went off to hide in Michigan. Clyde said that he hoped Hamilton, quote, choked on a wad of cash. In early April, Clyde and Fultz headed back to Texas, armed to the teeth, with the Dallas cops now looking for them for the failed oil refinery heist a couple of weeks earlier. Clyde visited his family and then spent a few hours with Bonnie. They spent their time outside because Emma Parker refused to let Clyde, now a wanted criminal, into her house. After seeing Bonnie, Clyde and Fultz drive to Denton, where they met 5 local hoodlums: Johnny Russell, Jack Hammett, Ralph Fuzz Alsop, Ted Rogers, and a guy known only to history as Red. That night, the men planned a raid on Eastern Prison Farm. Clyde wanted a little revenge for having been tormented during his time there. He also wanted to free Aubrey Scally, who had taken the rap for the murder of Ed Crowder. There was just one hitch, though. The fence in Dupo, Illinois, had cheated them. Many of the guns were faulty and didn't even fire. They planned to rob 2 banks at once in Denton on April the 11th to get some more cash to replace the faulty guns. But someone tipped off the police, and Texas Rangers were waiting outside the banks on the day of question, so the robberies had to be abandoned. Who's betraying them? It's a small little group. Uh-oh, someone's going to get killed. The gang had a rat. Yes, they did, David, but Clyde wasn't sure whom. Meanwhile, he traveled with Fultz and Red to Amarillo to recruit some more men for the Eastern raid. They arrived on April the 13th, but couldn't find the associates they were supposed to meet. They began to drive back to Dallas, but their car broke down in the small town of Electra. While they were prowling around the town looking for a car to steal, they were confronted by the local sheriff and a civilian he'd quickly deputized. The sheriff tried to haul them down to the station for questioning, but immediately ran away, while Clyde whipped out a .45 revolver, pointed it at the sheriff, and told the men to drop their weapons. As Clyde was disarming them, an innocent bystander A.F. McCormick came driving up the road. Foltz aimed a gun at him, then Clyde and Foltz forced the sheriff and deputy into McCormick's car, and they drove off with the 3 hostages. Clyde never saw Red again, and later concluded that he was the son of a bitch who'd ratted them out in Denton. Clyde and Foltz drove 8 miles south of Electra, apologized to the hostages for the inconvenience, and let them go. Once they were out of sight, Clyde and Foltz cut across a farmer's field and traveled north toward Oklahoma in order to confuse any pursuers. They had nearly crossed state lines when McCormick's car ran out of gas. Clyde and Foltz waited by the side of the road until they saw a passing postal truck and promptly hijacked it at gunpoint. They took the delivery man hostage and drove the car towards the Oklahoma border. They came upon a police checkpoint manned by 2 officers, and Clyde rammed through the chain barrier that they'd set up while the officers fired upon the vehicle. Outside the town of Fletcher, Oklahoma, Clyde released the hostage. The postal worker asked for his mail bag, which was given to him. The postal worker then requested Clyde burn the mail truck when he abandoned it, since it meant that the US Postal Service would be forced to buy the postal worker a new one. Clyde thought that this was hilarious and promised to do so. Clyde and Foltz torched the mail truck a day later, stole another car, and drove back to Dallas. Such a thoughtful criminal, looking out for the little man. On April the 17th, Bonnie Parker traveled to Easton Prison Farm and told the prison guards that she was Aubrey Scally's cousin there for a visit. The guards permitted Bonnie entry to the prison barracks, and she promptly told a pleasantly surprised Aubrey Scally that her lover, Clyde Barrow, intended to raid Easton and bust him out. After leaving the prison farm, Bonnie rejoined Clyde and Foltz on the night of the 18th, and they all traveled to the town of Tyler, where they stole a couple of large, fast cars for use in the Easton raid. Bonnie, Clyde, and Foltz, each in different cars, raced their vehicles as they went, and the newly stolen ones reached up to 90 miles per hour, which was pretty impressive for back in the day. On the way back, it now being midnight on April the 19th, the convoy passed through the town of Kaufman and decided to break into a local hardware store and steal its collection of guns. They were spotted by a night watchman who fired upon them. Clyde fired back. The night watchman ran for help. Realizing they only had a few minutes before the entire town of Kaufman, sheriff and civilians alike, descended upon them with guns drawn, Bonnie, Clyde, and Foltz tore out of Kaufman in their vehicles along with a dirt road which cut through some farmers' fields. It looked as if they were going to get away when it began to rain. The dirt road turned to mud and their cars got stuck. The outlaws were forced to abandon them and take off on foot. They ran for the better part of an hour, worried that pursuers from Kaufman might come after them. Eventually, soaking wet and with mud coating their legs, they came across a small farmhouse and begged for a ride into the nearest town, which turned out to be Kemp. The farmer replied that he didn't have a car, but generously offered to loan them his 2 mules. Clyde and Bonnie mounted one, Foltz mounted the other. They reached the outskirts of Kemp at dawn. There they stole a car from a driveway of the local doctor. Unfortunately, they were only a mile out of Kemp before the car ran out of gas. Worried that their pursuers from Kaufman might catch up with them, and now worried that the people of Kemp would immediately identify them as car thieves, Bonnie, Clyde, and Foltz hid in some bushes. At 7 a.m., a literal mob of people from Kaufman, Kemp, and nearby Mabank showed up and began combing through the countryside looking for the outlaws. Bonnie, Clyde, and Foltz stayed in the bushes for a whole 10 hours. At 5 p.m., they attempted to run across the street to a local store and steal a car that was parked there. It was no good. They were immediately spotted by the townsfolk. The mob quickly gathered and chased the outlaws towards Cedar Creek, firing shots at them all the while. Foltz was hit in the arm. When they reached the creek bed, Clyde abandoned Foltz and Bonnie, who were captured by the mob. Clyde got away, snuck back into Kemp, stole another car, and drove hell for leather until he reached Dallas. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Foltz were arrested, dragged back to Kemp, and thrown in a cell. The local doctor, whose car was stolen, refused to treat Foltz for his gunshot wound. Savage, Doc, didn't you take an oath? Rivers of whiskey and a hail of bullets. Clyde got back to Dallas on April the 20th in the morning and immediately sent Elsie and his sister-in-law, Blanche, wife of Ivan Barrow, who was still languishing in prison, to Kemp to find out where Bonnie and Foltz were being held. Turned out they had been transferred to the jail in Kaufman. Then Clyde drove to Denton and met up with Ted Rogers and Johnny Russell. On the night of the 20th, they broke into a hardware store in the town of Salina, coming away with some rifles and shotguns and robbing $16 from innocent bystanders, including the town mayor, who they held at gunpoint. On April the 21st, Clyde, Rogers, and Russell tested the guns at Lake Dallas. A local farmer heard the gunfire and called the sheriff. When the sheriff arrived, isn't this like in Texas? It's like, I heard gunfire down in them parts. And it's like, it's Texas. Like, when I think of Texas, I imagine large hats and guns. Isn't this like super common?
Never doubt the Texas Ranger.
When the sheriff arrived, backed by several deputies, Clyde, Rogers, and Russell were forced to abandon the newly stolen guns in order to escape. Things only got worse. They'd arranged to meet Jack Hammett and Fuzz Alsop at Lake Dallas, and the latter two arrived just in time to get arrested by the law. Meanwhile, Fultz was identified by the sheriff of Electra as the man who had taken him hostage, and he was later identified by the postal worker. He was shipped from Kaufman to Wichita Falls to stand trial for kidnapping. Bonnie remains locked up in Kaufman awaiting trial for attempted robbery. Bonnie claims she'd been kidnapped rather than being an active participant in the robbery. She languished in the Kaufman jail for 2 months. Clyde did not attempt to break her out. Bonnie passed the time in jail by writing poems, eventually gathering them into a collection called Poetry from Life's Other Side. Yeah. It's like, prison sounds pretty bad. I don't want to go to prison. But it's also like, yeah, I'll definitely write some shit. I'd love to write a book. Like David writes something. Look. David's smart and writes. But like, if I was in prison, I'd be like, gonna learn how to do that shit. Got nothing else to do. Might as well do that and chill and hopefully not be forced to like pick cotton. One of the poems in the collection is called The Prostitutes Convention, which actively named real-life prostitutes who were working in Dallas at the time, and in addition naming the street corners on which they operated. Bonnie's most notable poem from this collection was, with a slightly modified title thanks to YouTube censorship, the story of Self-Deletion Sal. It was about a girl who was brought into a life of crime by her lover, wound up in jail, and spent the next 5 years waiting for her lover to break her out. However, her lover had simply hooked up with another girl and gone straight. Sal was released from prison and shot and killed by an unknown assailant 2 days later. The poem includes the lines, quote, "Now, if he had returned to me some time, though he hadn't a penny to give, I'd forget all this hell he has caused me and love him as long as I live." It's not bad. It's not bad. On April the 28th, 1932, Clyde Rogers... Although I know nothing about poetry. I saw that movie, Peterson, about the dude who's a bus driver and a poet. And I was like, what is this? Is he supposed to be bad at poetry? Because it seems really bad. And then I think I was talking to my dad afterwards. And he was like, oh, yeah, I saw the Peterson movie as well. And I'm like, you did? Did you like it? And he's like, loved it. Beautiful poetry. And then I realized, I'm just not into poetry. Because my dad's like way more cultural than I am. And he was like, yeah, it's actually based on the poetry by this famous poet who was like consulting on the movie or whatever. And I was like, oh God, okay, I just don't understand this. This is like, when you look at who's the fucking painter? With Jackson Pollock, where he's just like splattering stuff on a surface. And you're like, okay, I just don't understand it. On April the 28th, 1932, Clyde, Rogers and Russell pretended to be customers and scouted out a combined jewelry and general store in the town of Hillsborough to the south of Dallas, owned by a man named John Napoleon Boucher. Clyde had actually met Boucher's wife, Medora, years earlier. While the gang cased the joint, she laid eyes on Clyde, but didn't give a sign that she recognized him. Nevertheless, the gang thought it best if Clyde acted as the getaway driver on this one, since they didn't want Medora to pick him out of a photo lineup later. At 10 p.m. on April the 30th, Clyde sat outside in the car while Rogers and Russell entered the store and held John and Medora Boucher at gunpoint. They marched John into the back and got him to open the safe. Inside, there was a gun, which John recklessly tried to turn upon the robbers. Oh, John, just don't do it. It's like, if you're getting mugged, don't say no. Just give them your fucking watch. Rogers and Russell shot him down. He later died of his wounds. Meanwhile, the gang made a clean getaway. The take from the robbery was $40 in cash, or $900 in today's modern money, and some jewelry collectively worth $1,500 or $34,000 in modern money. Okay, I was like, wait, they did all this for $900? $34,000 is a lot more. Despite their precautions, Medora Boucher immediately picked Kyle out of a photo lineup, and of course she did. The idiots had all been seen together in the store a couple of days ago when they were casing the joint. Yes, I was like, wait. I thought I must have misread something there. Because I'm like, wait, he's recognized by her while he's in the store, while they're casing it out with his mates. And then his mates come back and rob it. Of course she's going to be like, well, you guys were in here with him, who I know. So it's like, what? It's just so stupid. That was enough for the Texas authorities, and Clyde Barrow became wanted for murder. Wait, who did he murder? Oh no, wait, sorry, I totally missed that. They shot him. I was like, wait, who got murdered? And then I was like, oh wait, the guy who turned the gun. The guy said, just give them your watch. Oh God, I'm so slow sometimes. The Texas governor announced a $250 reward for his capture, $5,600 in modern money. The actual murderers, Roger and Russell, were not identified by Medora Boucher because she hadn't known them previously. They took their share of the loot and went their separate ways, never to rejoin the gang. Smart plan, although we know who they were and their names, so I guess they got caught up to later. On May the 11th, Ralph Fultz was sentenced to 10 years for the attempted robbery and the kidnappings. He, too, never rejoined the gang. On June the 17th, Bonnie went before the grand jury and spun the lie that she had been kidnapped by Fultz. The grand jury bought her story, and she was released. Bonnie returned home to her mother, Emma. She lied to her mother, saying that she was done with Clyde Barrow, but she started passing messages on to Clyde via the Barrow family immediately upon her return. Meanwhile, sometime in June, Clyde renewed his partnership with Ray Hamilton, the guy who had taken his share and split after the Kansas bank job 2 months previously. He had not, quote-unquote, choked on a wad of cash, and Clyde's anger at him had faded since then. In mid-July, Clyde and Hamilton procured a hideout in the town of Wichita Falls, 225 kilometers, or 140 miles northwest of Dallas, to use as a base of operations for future crimes. Bonnie packed up her things and joined them at the hideout, lying to her mother, saying that she had found a job as a waitress up there. And so, another spasm of robberies had begun. In late July, Clyde and Hamilton hit a train station in Grand Prairie, coming away with a whopping $12, or $270 in modern money. On August the 1st, Clyde Hamilton and a newly recruited getaway driver, Ross Dyer, hit the Neuhoff Packing Company in Dallas. They held 3 employees at gunpoint and came away with a take of $440, or $9,900 in modern money. Bonnie waited for Kumi at the Barrows place, listening to the radio for any news reports of the robbery. Amid their mutual anxiety for Clyde's safety, Kumi started to warm to Bonnie a little bit. Clyde swung by and picked up Bonnie late that afternoon and took her out to an abandoned farmhouse near Grand Prairie, where the gang partied for the next 4 days until August the 5th. Then Clyde took Bonnie back to the Barrows place, from where she made her way home to her mother. Bonnie told Emma that she was just visiting with the night. She had not come clean about being with Clyde. Meanwhile, also on August the 5th, Clyde, Hamilton, and Dyer drove 275 kilometers, 170 miles north, crossing state lines and arriving in Stringtown, Oklahoma at 9 p.m. There they spied a community dance in progress, attended by 900 people, most of them faced on moonshine whiskey. Oh, we still in Prohibition, right? Clyde, Hamilton, and Dyer swaggered into the crowd, began drinking heavily, and hitting on the young women there. This pissed off the local men. Sensing danger, the local sheriff, Charlie Maxwell, decided to remove the 3 outsiders from the situation. Probably a smart move. His plan was simple. He'd arrest them for drinking. Despite the fact that almost everybody at the dance was drinking, it was still technically illegal. At this point, Dyer was off mingling somewhere in the crowd. Meanwhile, Sheriff Maxwell and his deputy, Eugene Moore, approached Clyde and Hamilton, who were slamming back moonshine in their car, and told them they were under arrest. Clyde and Hamilton immediately pulled out their guns and opened fire. There's a bit of a running theme here, isn't it? They seem to do a lot of big crimes for very little reward. Like, they should have just been arrested and got let out for drinking, and that should have been that. They shouldn't rob people for like $6. They should rob people for more. If you're going to commit robbery, do it properly. Go and rob something where there's a bigger reward than like $6. If you're going to have a shootout with the cops, make sure they're not just arresting you for drinking. Why the massive overreaction? It's going to get you killed, as it does. Maxwell was hit 6 times and fell to the ground. His sidearm was picked up by an angry civilian, Harry Bryant, who began firing at the gang. Clyde put his vehicle into gear and tore out of there, but hit a nearby drainage pipe and flipped the whole car over. Bro. Flipping a car over today is probably quite dangerous. Flipping a car over in the 1920s is going to be a real bad time. The 2 men clambered out of the wreck, realizing that they'd have to shoot their way out. Well, apparently they were fine. Okay. Dyer, meanwhile, faded into the panicked crowd. Clyde and Hamilton unleashed another volley of gunfire, and Deputy Eugene Moore was dead before he hit the ground. Whoa, you just killed a cop who was going to arrest you for drinking. This is a massively unnecessary escalation. Harry Bryant made it to cover unscathed. Sheriff Maxwell was carried away by the crowd and actually recovered from his wounds, dulling the pain with moonshine whiskey. With the death of Eugene Moore, the Barrow gang had just killed a cop. In those days, that meant a guaranteed death sentence should they ever be caught. On their way out of Springtown, Clyde and Hamilton were pursued by authorities, but they managed to give them the slip, stealing a series of cars as they made their way successfully back to Dallas on August the 6th. Dyer had slipped away unnoticed and made his way to the town of McKinney back in Texas, where he was picked up by the cops. He was taken in for questioning and immediately spilled the beans, identifying Clyde and Hamilton as the Springtown shooters. That sealed Clyde's fate. From that point forward, the law wanted him dead. Good help is hard to find. Clyde Barrow had only been out of prison 6 months and things were already getting ugly. Arriving back in Dallas on August the 6th, 1932, Clyde sent Ray Hamilton to the Parker residence in a stolen Ford V8 to pick up Bonnie. For her part, Bonnie had kept up the lie to her mother that she'd dumped Kyle and was living in Wichita Falls working as a waitress. She climbed into Hamilton's car and wasn't to see her mother again for several months. Bonnie and Hamilton arrived at the rendezvous with Clyde, and it was Bonnie herself who suggested they drive to New Mexico to visit her Aunt Millie in order to escape the heat from the police manhunt in Texas and Oklahoma. Bonnie, Clyde, and Hamilton arrived in Carlsbad, New Mexico on August the 13th. Bonnie lied to her Aunt Millie, saying that she was driving across America on a honeymoon. She introduced Clyde as her husband, James White, and Hamilton as their friend, Jack Smith. It's a bit weird. It's like, hiya, yeah, we're driving across America as our honeymoon. And this is our mate, Jack. It's like, what the fuck's Jack doing here? Why is he on your honeymoon? Are you in some sort of weird, what's it called, where they have multiple wives? Polygamy. Are you in some weird polygamous marriage? Aunt Millie was initially very welcoming, but quickly grew suspicious of Clyde and Hamilton when they unloaded a huge arsenal of guns and began a target practice session outside her house. Well done laying low, guys. On the honeymoon, huh? With all these guns, right? When she was alone, Millie discreetly phoned the police. Deputy Sheriff Joe Johns arrived the next day, looked at the Ford V8 parked out front and suspected it was stolen. He knocked on the front door. Bonnie answered. Deputy Johns requested to speak to the car's owner. Bonnie said her husband was just getting dressed. Johns waited outside by the car. Clyde and Hamilton slipped around the back of the house, surprised the deputy, and pointed a shotgun at him. Deputy Johns tossed them his sidearm. They forced the deputy into the car, and the trio of outlaws took off with their new hostage. Oh no, that's a bad idea. You took a cop hostage? I mean, you already killed a cop, but you're really working towards the electric chair, aren't you guys? Heading east again. They pulled into San Antonio, Texas, late that evening. At one point, Bonnie giggled playfully and asked Deputy Johns, quote, "How do you like being on the run? You've had a few hours of it. We do it 365 days a year." It's a weird thing to say. At 5 a.m. on August the 15th, the gang drove 25 kilometers or 15 miles outside of San Antonio and dumped Deputy Johns on the side of the road. Oh my God. Deputy Johns, you made it out. Like, I honestly, they've killed a cop before, so they've already going to get the death penalty. So what have they got to lose? Nothing. And this dude's seen their face and all of this stuff and knows where they are and knows the car they're driving. I am amazed that Deputy Johns survived, and I imagine Deputy Johns is probably like, holy, you let me go? Okay, thanks. They drove onward to the town of Victoria, where they stole a second Ford V8 with Bonnie and Clyde in one car and Hamilton in the other, in the case one of them broke down on the journey. They were spotted in Victoria stealing the second car. The gang headed 100 kilometers or 60 miles northeast of the town of Wharton, where 2 police officers had set up a roadblock. Clyde managed to do a U-turn and head off in the opposite direction without a scratch. Hamilton did the same, but his car was hit with several bullets when the Wharton cops opened fire. Oh my God. It's like he's doing a U-turn. Either he doesn't want to wait in traffic or he's our guy. Get him! He's like Waze tells him, make a U-turn when possible. Despite this hiccup, the trio got away without any further trouble. On August the 16th, newspapers across Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico announced the police were looking for Clyde Barrow and Ray Hamilton. They also gave a physical description of a woman who was seen with them. The cops knew who Bonnie Parker was. Aunt Millie had ratted her out. But the newspapers had chivalrously declined to print Bonnie's name since they were not sure if she was being forced to accompany the bandits. Reading her description in the newspaper was how Emma Parker found out that her daughter wasn't in Wichita Falls after all. Surprise! Bonnie, meanwhile, was tickled pink by the publicity and often flattering descriptions of her. The trio spent the next 2 weeks hiding out in the abandoned farmhouse in Grand Prairie. During this time, they made one excursion. They drove to Fort Worth, broke into the armory of the State Guard, and stole 6 Browning automatic rifles. Jesus, how are you breaking into, like, the State Guard's armory? Aren't armories, like, super heavily guarded? This was some serious firepower that would overwhelm any law enforcement that they were likely to meet in the future. And note to Simon, here's a clip of a fully automatic Browning on fast fire ripping into a cinder block wall. Oh my lord. Okay, we'll show that clip, assuming we don't get a copyright claim for it. It'll be a little clip of it playing now. And from David's description, I imagine it's absolutely brutal. Meanwhile, Ray Hamilton had been getting cold feet again. He told Bonnie and Clyde that he was going to head up to Michigan once more to lie low. Clyde and Hamilton parted on much more amicable terms than they had the last time. Bonnie and Clyde even drove Hamilton north all the way to Bay City in Michigan before parting ways. From there, Bonnie and Clyde spent some time driving randomly around the Midwest. Clyde would occasionally occasionally rob a rural store or a gas station to keep them within spending money, with takes of $5 to $10 or about $120 to $125 in modern money. They liked staying the night in motels, which were still something of a novelty in 1932. When those weren't available, they stayed as guests at farmhouses across the countryside. At the time, the old-fashioned country manners of providing a roof and a hot meal to wayfarers still prevailed, and Clyde Barrow and his mysterious female traveling companion weren't yet well known outside of Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. I'm so glad we don't live in the past. Like, if I lived out in the countryside, and occasionally someone would be like, "Oh, do you mind if I stay with you and have dinner?" And I'd be like, "Well, I had plans. I was going to watch the new season of For All Mankind and play with my kids, but I guess instead I'm going to have to talk to a stranger the whole night and then have you stay in my house with all my valuables and my children. And I have no idea who you are. You're just a random wayfarer." Oh, the past was the worst. It was also pretty clear that the couple of lovebirds were on the run, but Bonnie was charming and soon put her hosts at ease. And anyway, it was the Depression, and most rural Americans couldn't give a flying about what the government or the local law wanted. In October, Bonnie and Clyde headed south again, spending a couple of weeks in Kansas. They returned to Dallas to visit their families on Halloween. Because the cops might be watching the Barrow gas station, the family had arranged a system of communications. Clyde drove past the station and tossed an empty Coke bottle with a note inside with instructions for the time and place of the rendezvous point. Then, Bonnie and Clyde took a risk and swung by the Parker residence after looking to see if the place was being watched. Bonnie nipped inside for only a few minutes' visitation with her mother. Bonnie updated an anxious Emma on how she was doing and quickly left, avoiding all discussion of the fact that she had lied and was once again running off with an outlaw. After that, the couple headed off to the rendezvous point to meet up with the Barrow clan, where Clyde found out that Texas newspapers were accusing him of robberies that he hadn't committed, along with the murder of a butcher named Howard Hall in the town of Sherman and the murder of Sheriff John Mosley in the town of Tallua. Alternatively, according to Clyde's sister Nell, Clyde was indifferent, saying laconically, "Oh well, they've got to hang it on somebody, you know? Yeah, it's like, dude, they've already killed a cop. They've killed, it doesn't matter." But it does mean that whoever did kill these people is kind of getting away with it, which isn't great. While still in Dallas, Bonnie and Clyde recruited 2 new gang members to replace Ray Hamilton, Frank Hardy and Hollis Hale, who, thanks to the newspapers, thought Clyde was a criminal mastermind and eagerly joined him for the prestige. They headed up to Carthage, Missouri, together. They tried to rob the bank, only to be told upon forcing their way into the building that the bank had gone bust a few days earlier and that there was no money on the premises. So the Barrow Gang, as it was now called, shifted focus towards the Farmers and Miners Bank in the tiny Missouri town of Oronogo. On November the 29th, 1932, they sent in Bonnie to case the joint. The next day, November the 30th at 11:30 a.m., Clyde and Hardy entered the bank wielding Browning automatic rifles, while Hale acted as a getaway driver and Bonnie sat beside him in the car. As Clyde and Hardy entered the bank, the lone bank clerk on duty grabbed a pistol that was right next to him and ducked behind the lead-lined counter that was impervious to bullets. Dude. If I'm the clerk in this thing, I'll be like, "Hello, gentlemen. Should we just go straight to the safe and not mess around? Because I'm not getting shot to protect someone else's money." The clerk lifted the gun in the air without raising his head and started letting off blind shots in the general direction of the robbers. Clyde let loose with a volley from the Browning, riddling the bank with bullets. The clerk's gun jammed. Hardy grabs what little money you could see resting on the counter before the 2 robbers fled. The take was $110 or $2,500 in modern money. These 2 botched jobs in Missouri thoroughly disillusioned Hale and Hardy about Clyde. And when they got back to Carthage, they said they were going to buy more ammunition and never came back. It's like, we thought you guys were good. You got this whole reputation. It just turns out you're a bit shit at your whole crime thing. Bonnie and Clyde were again in need of fresh recruits. They headed back into Texas to the town of McKinney, where Ralph Fultz had recently stood trial for car theft. He was joined there by Ted Rogers, one of the men who had gunned down John Napoleon Boucher in Hillsborough, who had been picked up in McKinney on an unrelated robbery charge. They were both awaiting to be transferred to the prison in Huntsville. On December the 19th, Bonnie visited the jail, pretending to be a relative of Fultz, and told him that Clyde was outside, heavily armed, ready to break him and Rogers out. Fultz replied it was no good since the deputy didn't have the cell keys, so Clyde needed to hit the place the next morning when the sheriff had returned. Wow, is breaking people out of prison really this easy? It's like, no, come back tomorrow, then the guy with the keys will be here and it'll be an easy job. Bonnie and Clyde showed up at the jail at 4 a.m. the next morning, only to see the prison wagon carting Fultz and Rogers back to Huntsville. Meanwhile, on December the 6th, 1932, Ray Hamilton was picked up by the cops in Michigan. He was quickly connected to Clyde Barrow. On December the 14th, Hamilton was extradited to Dallas. Megora Boucher was driven up from Hillsborough and incorrectly identified Hamilton as one of her husband's killers. Oddly enough, Hamilton was not connected to the murder of Deputy Eugene Moore in Oklahoma, in which he had actually participated. Oklahoma authorities simply didn't send anyone down to identify him, but Hamilton might get the electric chair for the Boucher murder anyway, and one death sentence was as permanent as another. Clyde, meanwhile, began making plans to bust Hamilton out. Yeah, I get it, like the bad guy gets the chair, but also there's another bad guy out there who is like, they're like, case closed, we got our man, and it's like, yeah, but you didn't.
Case closed.
Bonnie and Clyde spent Christmas Eve back in Dallas, where they exchanged gifts with their families at a nighttime rendezvous. That same evening, Bonnie and Clyde recruited William Daniel Jones to join them on their cross-country crime spree. It's apparently very easy to recruit. Like, I feel like they're in a video game, just going into the town and recruiting people. It's like, but you're robbing people for like $100. Jones was 16 years old. Bonnie and Clyde were 22 at the time. The trio traveled 210 kilometers, 130 miles, south to the town of Temple in yet another stolen Ford V8. Wow, that really is their vehicle of choice, isn't it? It again feels like a video game. It's like, you're stealing your favorite car in Grand Theft Auto. It was the make that Clyde preferred to steal because it could outrun cop cars. On Christmas morning, Clyde and Jones entered a grocery store in the town of Temple. Jones was supposed to stick up the cashier, but lost his nerve before drawing his gun. They aborted the robbery, and the clerk was none the wiser. They headed back to the V8. Clyde called Jones a coward, and Bonnie mocked him and openly laughed in his face. Jones said that he wanted to go home. I want to go home. He's 16, poor f***ing kid. Clyde snarled that if he didn't want to walk, he'd better steal a car for himself. He ordered Jones to steal a Ford Model A sitting nearby. Jones broke into the car, but failed to hotwire it. Clyde stomped over and got into the Ford, starting it successfully and shaming Jones still further. Jones is a terrible criminal. He's like, I'm too nervous to stick up a convenience store. I don't know how to hotwire a car. I mean, he sounds like a completely normal person because I have no idea. I assume you can't hotwire cars anymore, right? You can't just, like, in the movies, they just rip the thing off and join two wires together. I'm pretty sure, like, I don't think I have a car that starts with a key anymore. They all just start with buttons. But they were spotted by the car's owner, 27-year-old Doyle Johnson, who came running up to the vehicle, reached through the driver's side window, and started strangling Clyde with his bare hands. Clyde raised his pistol and shot Johnson several times at point-blank range. That's why you don't interfere. If someone's stealing your car, let them steal your car. It's not worth getting shot over. And then just file an insurance claim. Christ. If I saw someone stealing my car right now, I'd be like, have a nice day. Good luck. Gonna get a new car. Then Clyde and Jones sped away. Bonnie followed them in the V8. Johnson died of his wounds within minutes. Yes, he's been shot multiple times at point-blank range. Punctuations of pure havoc. On January 1st, 1933, Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones were back in Dallas. Clyde paid a visit to Lillian McBride, the sister of Ray Hamilton, who was now locked up in Hillsborough, awaiting trial for the Boucher murder. Clyde handed Lillian a hacksaw and told her to travel down to Hillsborough and smuggle it to her brother during a visit. Lillian promptly did so. On the afternoon of January 6th, the cops came by Lillian's house to ask her a few questions about her brother. After they left, Lillian also departed to go on the piss downtown Dallas with her friend Lucille Hilburn. At 6 p.m., Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones swung by Lillian's place to find out if she'd smuggled in the hacksaw. Finding she wasn't at home, they headed to the Parker residence. Emma Parker was angry to discover that Bonnie had been drinking whiskey all day and was completely faced. Not again, Bonnie. You had things to do, Bonnie. You can't just get faced in the morning all the time. The trio then paid visits to Barrow's and Jones's mother. At 11 p.m., 5 cops went to Lillian McBride's place, suspecting that she might be harboring another criminal associate of Ray Hamilton's named Odell Chambliss. Lillian still wasn't home. The cops were let in by Lillian's sister Maggie. They waited in the front room for Lillian and kept an eye out for Chambliss. At midnight, Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones drove slowly past Lillian McBride's house with their headlights turned off to see if she was home yet. The cops spotted them. Clyde drove around the block and then stopped in front of the house. Suspecting something was up, Clyde got out of the car with a shotgun. He approached the front door. At this point, Maggie ran screaming out of the house, and Clyde looked in the window and immediately saw 3 cops sitting in the front room. He fired his shotgun through the window. 2 cops standing vigil at the back of the house heard the gunfire and ran around the front. Clyde blasted one of them, Deputy Malcolm Davis, at point-blank range, killing him instantly. The second cop dropped immediately to the ground, and Clyde's next blast missed him. The three cops in the living room began shooting out the window at Clyde, and in response, Jones, hanging out the window of the V8, let loose on the front of the house with a volley from the Browning automatic rifle. This gave Clyde an opportunity to run between houses and around the block. The still partially shit-faced Bonnie yelled at Jones to stop firing. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal and they tore off down the road. They turned a corner and spotted Clyde, who jumped in and took over driving, and they sped away. Ray Hamilton was caught trying to use the hacksaw on the bars of his cell on January the 8th. Clyde gave up on trying to bust him out. Meanwhile, the shootout had been such an embarrassment to the Dallas police that Sheriff Smoot Schmid pumped more resources into bringing Clyde Barrow to justice. Two men were appointed to track them down. Veteran officer Bob Alcorn, who had numerous run-ins with the Barrow family over the years, and Deputy Ted Hinton, a former postal worker who had become infatuated with Bonnie Parker when she had waitressed at Marco's restaurant in 1929. Wait, it's the same dude! Is that the same dude who we were talking about earlier, who became infatuated with her and went to the expensive restaurants? I'm not going to go back because it was like 100 pages ago, but I think it was, right? What are the odds? Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones got the hell out of Dallas. But in their haste, Clyde spun out into a farmer's field where the V8's wheels sank into the mud. They paid a nearby farmer $3 to pull the car out with a team of mules. Then the trio drove overnight across state lines. On January the 26th, 1933, outside of Springfield, Missouri, they were tailed by a 24-year-old highway patrolman named Thomas Purcell, who suspected the Ford V8 was stolen. When Purcell approached the vehicle, he was held at gunpoint, disarmed, and told to get in. Clyde didn't want to kill a cop in Missouri, since it would amp up hostilities toward him in that state. They drove until after midnight when they reached Joplin and dropped Purcell off. He asked for his gun back, and Clyde refused. Bold move, Purcell. Can I have my gun back? No! Get the out of here, we're letting you go. What more do you want? Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones spent January through March 1933 doing petty robberies of country stores in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas. They stole a sequence of cars, as per usual, and began removing and swapping license plates on the vehicles. Their robberies that this time did not merit any organized pursuit, and so Bonnie and Clyde relaxed and enjoyed some semblance of freedom. I remember, license plates. A mate of mine, when we were at university, just came out to his car one morning, and both of his license plates were missing. And they weren't they were just regular ass license plates. And he's like, where are my license plates at? Why did someone steal my license plates? And I can't remember what got him to do it, but he phoned the police because apparently if you've had your license plates nicked, the chances are that it's like a criminal organization who are going to put them on another car and then use that car for crimes. And they'll just steal random license plates from another vehicle about the same age, because you can tell the age of cars from the license plates in the UK. And yeah, the police were like, well, it's good you told us, because your plates might be used in a crime. It's like, okay. It was during this time, by the side of a highway, that Jones took the now famous picture of Bonnie and Clyde together, along with Bonnie leaning on the car with a revolver in one hand and a cigar clenched between her teeth. The trio often shared a single motel room. Bonnie and Clyde would send out Jones on frequent errands, giving the couple a chance to make love. One thing that surprised Jones was that both Bonnie and Clyde prayed a lot. They were still highly devout Christians due to their upbringing, albeit with a somewhat unorthodox take on the Ten Commandments. Bonnie called Clyde Daddy, Clyde called her Honey, and both of them addressed Jones as Boy. Jones is their bitch. For his part, Jones called Bonnie Sis and Clyde Bud. Bud's like, all right, boy, settle down. Go get me a newspaper. On March the 23rd, 1933, Ivan Barrow, nicknamed Buck, was paroled from Huntsville prison, despite the fact that he'd escaped from jail and spent several weeks on the lam, adding 4 extra years to his sentence before Kumi Barrow convinced Ivan to return to prison voluntarily. His wife, Blanche, was overjoyed to have him back. On March the 24th, they visited Blanche's parents at their dairy farm in the rural community of Wilmer. At midnight, Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones showed up at the farmhouse. Blanche noted that both Clyde and Jones carried shotguns inside the house and that Bonnie was utterly rat-arsed on whiskey. Surprise! Bonnie and Clyde convinced Ivan and Blanche to join them for a few weeks in an apartment that they'd rented in Joplin, Missouri. They assured Ivan and Blanche they wouldn't be committing any crimes during that time. It'd be like a vacation for all of them. Blanche later claimed that she and her husband were reluctant to get involved with Bonnie and Clyde, but quite frankly, I smell bullshit. At any rate, Blanche and Ivan agreed to go. Blanche brought her dog Snowball. They stayed for a week in 2 rented holiday cabins outside Joplin before finding a fashionable suburban apartment on April the 1st that rented for $50 a month or $1,120 in modern money. A apartment big enough for all of them for $1,000 in modern money? It's pretty good. Where are we talking about? Joplin. Was this in Arkansas? Missouri. I don't know anything about Missouri. I don't even know where Missouri is. All 5 of them had grown up in the slums of Dallas, so for them, this was quite palatial living. The neighborhood was so posh that there was a local night watchman. Bonnie and Clyde thought it was hilarious to hire him to patrol outside of their apartment as well. They used a laundry delivery service that picked up dirty clothes and dropped off freshly laundered ones, which is super nice. I've done this a couple of times, like when we got back from holiday or something. And my wife and I have been like, there's a lot of laundry to do, isn't there? And there's just a company you can call up and they come and collect it all. And then they bring it back to you like pressed and folded. And it's just like, well, that was easier, wasn't it? Bonnie and Blanche went on frequent shopping sprees. On April the 7th, Prohibition in the United States officially came to an end, and the gang celebrated by purchasing a case of beer and drinking it all in one night. The following night, they bought another, and then another, and another. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, if Prohibition ended, I'd go pretty hard on it for a while. You'd be like, yes, cold beer, let's go, rather than moonshine or leftover whiskey or whatever they're drinking for years. Thereafter, to get more money, Clyde, Jones, and Ivan robbed a few stores and houses in rural Missouri. They also stole several more Browning automatic rifles from a local armory of the National Guard. The next day, when Clyde was cleaning them, one went off accidentally, and one of the neighbors called the police. The cops didn't go barging over there, but they decided to keep an eye on the place. On April the 12th, the gang stole a roadster from a town in Oklahoma and drove it back to Missouri. What's a roadster? Is that like a convertible car? Tesla Roadster is what I get when I look it up. I guess it's like a convertible car, right? Like a roadster. Bonnie thought this was too risky, and she and Clyde argued. The argument turned violent. According to Blanche, quote, Clyde knocked her across the bedroom a couple of times, but she got up and went back for more. They reconciled before Bonnie went to sleep. Oh, Clyde. Just a bit of casual 1930s domestic abuse. That night, Clyde decided that they'd stayed in Joplin for too long. It was time to go. The next day, April 13th, Clyde and Jones went out to rob another store for traveling money, while the rest of them all packed. At 4 p.m., Clyde and Jones returned, and moments later, 2 cars containing 5 police officers pulled in behind them. The Joplin PD had decided to raid the place. Clyde and Jones pulled into the apartment's garage and quickly lowered the garage door behind them. Constable Wes Harriman bravely but recklessly tried to dive under the door before it closed. Clyde hit him with a shotgun blast to the neck. Harriman bled out and died at the scene. Oh, Harriman, don't do that. Why would you do that? You're going to go into an unfamiliar environment, and they're just going to be waiting for you. Officer Harry McGinnis fired a few shots through a glass window looking into the garage, striking Jones once in the abdomen. Excellent. Before Clyde pummeled McGinnis with the second blast of his shotgun, hitting him in the face and damn near blasting his arm clean off his body. McGinnis died instantly. A third officer, DeGraff, dived and picked up McGinnis's revolver and began dual-wielding as he fired at the garage and ducked behind the side of the apartment building with a fourth officer, Grammer. The fifth officer, Carla, ran across the street to find a phone to call for backup. Joplin police cars did not come equipped with radios at the time. Meanwhile, Ivan came running into the garage, armed with a shotgun to help with the shootout. Jones, bleeding heavily, ran upstairs to tell the girls that they needed to get out of there now. Abandoning most of their things and with Bonnie still in a nightgown, they ran down to the garage. They intended to escape in one of the 2 stolen cars, the Ford V8 sedan. The gang daringly opened the garage door in a bid to escape. Ivan moved McGinnis's corpse out of the way, while Clyde and Jones, the latter of whom was now soaked in his own blood, pushed from the cop cars blocking the garage. Yeah, dude. What's his face? Jones? You're f***ed, mate. You got shot in the gut in the 1930s, and you're not going to be able to go to a hospital? It's game over. Then the 2 of the 3 surviving cops resumed fire. Clyde was hit in the chest with a bullet. Holy! But it was low caliber and came from across the street. The bullet passed through one of his coat buttons, so it merely lodged in the top layer of his flesh. Oh, grim though. But incredible odds. What are the odds? Meanwhile, Ivan was grazed by another bullet that ricocheted off the garage wall. It was then that Bonnie, still clad in her only nightie, came out of the garage with a Browning automatic rifle and sprayed bullets at Officer Carla, who was firing from across the street. He was forced to dive behind an oak tree. When Bonnie's rapid machine gun fire sent splinters of wood flying into his face, Bonnie pivoted and unleashed a final volley of her remaining bullets at the 2 officers hiding around the side of the building. Then Clyde and Ivan rallied and opened fire with their shotguns. It was at this point that Blanche's dog Snowball ran terrified out of the garage into the street. Blanche called out desperately after him. The dog ignored her and kept running down the road, never to be seen again. Ivan yanked a thoroughly upset Blanche into the sedan, and the 5 of them piled in and tore out of the driveway while under minimal fire from the surviving police officers. 2 cops were dead. Carla had splinters in his face, and he didn't think his gun's bullets would pierce the car's exterior as it passed. DeGraff fired 4 shots before running out of ammo, and the final cop, Grammer, just stood there, shell-shocked, without having fired a single bullet in the entire exchange. The Barrow Gang in light and shade. The Ford V8 sedan hurtled out of Joplin at blinding speed. Once enough distance had been put between them and the town, Clyde pulled over. Bonnie ripped open Clyde's shirt and prized the bullet lodged in his chest out with a hairpin in her fingers. Oh, infection time. It's the 1930s, we got antibiotics yet? I think so. Right? At least there's that. Clyde quickly staunched the bleeding and inspected Jones's bullet wound. It was bad. Jones was in agony and still bleeding. And it was unclear, with all the blood, whether the bullet was still in him. Carl took a thin tree branch, wrapped it in a scrap of cloth torn from Bonnie's nightgown, and poked it into the bullet hole in Jones's abdomen. When the branch poked right through the other side of Jones's body, they discovered the exit wound. At least the bullet wasn't still lodged in Jones's body. They staunched his bleeding as much as they could, drove down the road to a gas station and bought a packet of aspirin, which they promptly entered into Jones's mouth. Here, take this aspirin, it'll make you feel much better.
You know I've been shot, right? There's a bullet that's gone through my body.
Also, I think it's just one of those Hollywood rumors. I think if you are shot, it's like not super important to get the bullet out quickly, because even like going in there with the tree branch and stuff, I feel like that's going to cause more damage than a bullet, because the bullet's probably like, is it going to be superheated and stuff? It's probably not going to cause like too much of an infection, but like a weird stick wrapped in a nightie, that's going to be like covered in bacteria that are now being poked into the deepest parts of his body. With that, Clyde kicked the V8 into gear and headed toward Texas. He drove all night until they arrived at the town of Shamrock in the early hours of the morning, where Blanche, doing her best to hide the blood splatter on her dress, checked them into a motel. The male gang members had their wounds washed and dressed. Jones was still in bad shape, but didn't seem to be dying. Nothing vital was hit. Blanche, again self-conscious about the bloodstains on her dress, walked to a grocery store and bought everyone some food. He seems to be fine. Nothing vital was hit. It went through his body. There's all sorts of important things here, like your spleen and other stuff. A few hours later, Clyde got paranoid about a couple of cars parked outside the motel, and the gang piled into the sedan and drove towards Amarillo, arriving on the outskirts at nightfall. Ivan and Clyde headed into the city and robbed a store. The next morning, the gang used the money to buy some new clothes, for they had left the shootout with just the clothing on their backs. Back in Joplin, the police found Blanche Barrow's purse and ID, Ivan and Blanche's marriage license, and paperwork relating to Ivan's release from Huntsville. You're carrying all of your documents with you, are you? The Joplin cops contacted Dallas. Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton came up and showed them photographs of Clyde Barrow and gave them a description of Bonnie Parker, connecting the couple to the Joplin shootout as well. Only 16-year-old William Jones remained unidentified. Police also found a large arsenal of weapons, several suitcases of fancy clothes, a large collection of jewelry, Clyde's guitar, a draft of Bonnie's poem about self-deletion, thank you YouTube Sal, some cameras, and several rolls of undeveloped film. It was the last of these things that completely transformed the situation, for better and for worse. Okay. Well, I'm very curious what's on those rolls of film. I mean, I assume it's going to be them doing crime, so I'm not sure how this is for better and for worse. What's going to be on there? On April the 14th, the film was developed. A few of the photos were of Clyde and Jones striking to tremendously douchey gangster poses in front of a stolen car. Some things never change. But then there were the photos of Bonnie Parker in Clyde's arms, or holding him at mock gunpoint, or posing scandalously with a gun and a cigar. There were several outlaws, like Clyde, in the Depression era, but this was new. A female outlaw. Not just a gangster moll, but a female outlaw actively participating in the crimes. Bonnie Parker was 22 years old, reasonably attractive, and very stylishly dressed. Then, as now, sex sells, and the next day, April the 15th, the Joplin Globe placed her on the front cover alongside Clyde. They even mentioned Bonnie by name. Within days, most newspapers across the United States had picked up on the story. Bonnie and Clyde's photos soon were shown in newsreels. They were featured in celebrity gossip magazines. They were featured in true crime magazines. They were featured everywhere. Updates on their crime spree were trumpeted on the radio, interrupting scheduled programming. Within a month, the story had gone international, and despite the fact that they were gunning down police officers and bystanders and robbing small-time businesses of their hard-earned money during an economic depression, the public loved them. Bonnie and Clyde were young, they were stylish, they were sexy, or at least Bonnie was, and they were fighting back against the rich and powerful. They weren't seen as murderers, they were seen as heroes. They've murdered multiple police officers. And I know people have like different opinions about police officers and stuff, but murdering anyone's not okay. Murdering bad people, but like murdering cops is like not okay. Bonnie was bursting with joy. At long last, she was famous. Oh, Bonnie, you're not famous, you're infamous. It's really different. What's that great quote? If I can't become famous, infamy will do. Sounds like something Bonnie would say. Who said that? And all it took to make a little girl's dreams come true was a growing stack of corpses, all of them people who didn't deserve to die. On April the 27th, in the town of Ruston, Louisiana, a still wounded but recovering William Jones stole a Chevrolet parked in front of a house with the keys left in its ignition. The car's owner, an undertaker named Dillard Darby, saw this happen from the porch of the house as he was chatting with a home economics expert named Sophia Stone. Darby and Stone hopped into the latter's car and gave chase. They pursued Jones out of Ruston, but lost him. But Clyde, racing up from behind, forced Darby to pull over, pistol-whipped him, and took Stone and Darby hostage. Jones and the Chevy had vanished, so Clyde drove the hostages, Bonnie, Ivan, and Blanche, into Arkansas. The car was packed full. A drunk Ivan was encouraging Clyde to just kill the hostages. Bonnie, meanwhile, asked Darby what he did for a living. He told her that he was an undertaker. Bonnie laughed and said, "Maybe you'll work on me someday." Clyde dumped the hostages outside the town of Waldo, giving them an extra $5 to get home. It's kind of nice. Isn't $5? Isn't that going to be like a lot of money? Like, it's back in the day. Normally David gives me the conversion, but I don't know, but it's a lot. Passing through the town of Hope, Arkansas, the Barrow gang was spotted by a patrol car, which immediately gave chase. By now, the cops knew that Clyde preferred to drive Ford V8s and treated them as suspicious. Ivan aimed a Browning automatic rifle out of the window at the cop car, but held his fire. Clyde managed to lose them without the necessity of a shootout. There were no signs of Jones in the Chevy, and the gang worried that it had either been picked up by the cops or his wound had taken a turn for the worst. At any rate, the gang decided Jones was most likely to head back to Dallas now that they'd been separated, so Clyde started driving there too. At the very least, they could visit their families. They spend a lot of time visiting their families for like outlaws who don't really seem to care if they live or die. Clyde and the gang pulled into the driveway of the Barrow gas station, taking the risk that the cops weren't watching the place. Clyde spoke to his family for 5 minutes and told them that when Jones showed up to tell him to lie low in Dallas, the gang would be back to collect him. With that, the Barrow gang rode out of Dallas again. For the next several days, they rolled through Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, robbing county stores and gas stations whenever they needed money. On the night of May the 11th, 1933, Clyde and Ivan broke into a bank in Lucerne, Indiana, hoping to ambush the staff the next morning and force them to open the vault. The next morning came, and one of the tellers grabbed a rifle that was concealed under the front counter. A firefight erupted. No one was hit. Tellers back in the day. Was it like, I feel like it's the past. So the bank manager would be like, yo, if someone comes in trying to rob the place, here's a gun. You better use it or you're getting fired. I remember when I worked in a store, they were like, yo, if anyone comes in and tries to rob, don't even press the alarm. There was like this alarm button under the till that you could press. And they're like, don't press it until they've left. Give them whatever they want and then press the button. Don't be a hero. We don't want to have to pay for your funeral or whatever. But fearing the cops might arrive, Clyde and Ivan fled the bank empty-handed, with Bonnie acting as the getaway driver. The gunfire had attracted the attention of the townsfolk. A man jumped on the hood of the car as the gang tried to escape. What are you doing? Get off the car, you idiot! Bonnie grabbed a pistol and shot at him. The man wisely chose to jump off. On the way out of town, random townsfolk started shooting at the Ford. The gang shot back. It's like the fucking Wild West over here. 2 bystanders were wounded. On the night of May the 18th, the gang tried again, with Clyde and Ivan breaking into another bank in Okabena in Minnesota. This time, Clyde took the precaution of sweeping the bank for hidden guns. The next morning, they ambushed the staff and came away with a take of $1,600 or 38 grand in today's modern money. Yes, that's a take. Bonnie again acted as the getaway driver, and again, random townsfolk shot at the gang as they sped out of town. God bless America. Yeah, it's some Wild West. They're just like, hey, pew, pew! Just like Grand Theft Auto. Jesus. On May the 22nd, the Barrow gang was back in Texas. Clyde sent Blanche into Dallas to arrange a rendezvous with the Barrow and Parker clans. They all wound up having a picnic. Oh, lovely. Clyde asked about Jones. He was told that the boy was back in town, but nobody from the Barrow or Parker clans had seen him. Without looking for him, the gang packed up and headed east. When they crossed into Louisiana, Ivan stole a second car so that he could ride separately with Blanche. Being crammed in one car was testing everybody's nerves, with Clyde and Ivan at one point getting into a fist fight. The Barrow gang reached Florida on June the 1st for a vacation of sorts. Laying low, spending time at the beach, and spending their Okabena money. Yeah, they got 38 grand. They're going to have a pretty awesome vacation. Elsewhere on June the 2nd, Ray Hamilton was given 99 years in prison for the murder of John Napoleon Boucher, which he didn't commit. He was sent to Easton Prison Farm. Yeah, but he did kill someone else, right? And we were just complaining that old Napoleon Boucher is his actual killer's going to be out on the loose. After a few days of sunshine in Florida, Bonnie and Clyde headed back to Dallas on June the 8th and finally picked up William Jones, the guy who somehow miraculously survived a bullet going through his body in the 1930s and then having a stick with a nightie wrapped around it poked all inside his body. William Jones, you survivor. Meanwhile, Blanche and Ivan had gone to Oklahoma to meet up with Blanche's father and would rendezvous with the other 3 gang members in Oklahoma on the night of the 10th. Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones relaxed in the small town of Wellington, Texas on June the 9th. Bonnie did a lot of drinking. Surprise! Then, just outside Wellington, while heading out to Oklahoma on the evening of the 10th, Clyde was driving too fast and smashed through a construction barricade, losing control of the car, and crashed into a riverbed. No one was killed, but the Ford's car battery had been smashed open, sending a jet of acid all over Bonnie's right leg. Oh, Jesus. The damage was instant and severe. William Jones later said that the hide on her right leg was gone. From her hip down to her ankle, I could see bone at places. Oh my God. Is car battery acid that acidic? F***ing hell, it just burned to her bones. 2 bystanders, Jack Pritchard and his son-in-law, saw the crash and took the trio to their nearby farmhouse. Bonnie and Clyde were concussed. Clyde had a broken nose. Jones had a few burns on him. The Pritchard family put baking soda on Bonnie's leg wounds, which neutralized the acid and prevented any further damage. That's smart. I'm like, that sounds super unpleasant, but I didn't even know baking soda neutralized acid. So that's good to know. When Pritchard said they needed to get to a doctor, Clyde refused for fear that it would tip off the authorities, replying, "If she dies, she will just have to die." As Bonnie lay in agony, Clyde went to the wrecked Ford and retrieved their arsenal of guns. This caused some alarm in the Pritchard family. One of them snuck off to Wellington to inform County Sheriff George Corey and Police Chief Paul Hardy that there were some suspicious types at their farmhouse. Yeah, there's a woman. She's got a bony leg, and they've got loads of guns, and they don't want to go to the doctor. Corey and Hardy headed up there alone in an unmarked Chevrolet, thinking that they were just a few delinquents with a couple of firearms. They were greeted at the farmhouse by Clyde, armed with a Browning automatic rifle, and Jones with a shotgun. Bonnie got off her sickbed and grabbed the 2 officers' sidearms. Jones quipped, "You boys are just in time. We want to borrow your car." Crime always pays in gold or lead. Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones took off in the Chevrolet with their 2 new hostages. Clyde and Jones sat in the front seat, with Jones turning around and holding the hostages at gunpoint. Bonnie, still in very rough shape from the acid dousing, yeah. Still in, like, oh no, I was expecting her to be better by now. No, her leg was acided off to the bone, and then they basically just threw some baking soda and were like, jobs are good, she'll be fine. Her leg is missing. She was actually laying down in the back seat across Corey and Hardy's laps. The car travelled into Oklahoma, arriving at the rendezvous point at 1 a.m. on the 11th. Blanche and Ivan were already there waiting, asleep in their car. The gang tied Corey and Hardy to a couple of trees by the side of the road and took off. Bonnie was in desperate need of medical attention. Again, yes, she's missing half her leg. She couldn't sleep because of the pain, periodically passing out from exhaustion, only to awaken again, moaning in agony. But the gang couldn't rush her to a doctor's, since word would eventually circulate about Bonnie's injury, and doctors in the area would be on the lookout for a woman with a burned leg. Yeah, I remember I broke some ribs in my back, or like whatever the back ribs are called. Or like, I don't know what it was. Like these things, you know, the ribs in the back, like by the spine. Are they ribs? The ribs go all the way around, right? And I'd wake up in the night and just be like, oh, God, why? I'm not comparing that to like having my leg burned off with acid, but I do understand that just waking up in agony and just being like, oh, why am I awake? But the gang couldn't rush her to the doctor since word would eventually circulate about Bonnie's injury, and doctors in the area would be on the lookout for a woman with a burned leg. Clyde drove through Oklahoma and Kansas before turning around and heading southeast. Every day, they stopped at a drugstore for salve and bandages for Bonnie's leg. On June the 15th, the gang reached Fort Smith, Arkansas, and rented 2 holiday cabins. Clyde lied to a local doctor that Bonnie had been injured when a stove exploded. The doctor flatly told him that Bonnie needed to go to a hospital, but Clyde refused. The doctor resignedly wrote a prescription for barbiturate painkillers while the leg tried to heal on its own. When the doctor visited 2 days later, he again urged Bonnie to be taken to the hospital. Clyde refused yet again. Bonnie spent the next few days in a drug-induced haze, flying into angry withdrawals whenever the drugs wore off. On June the 18th, Clyde drove overnight to Dallas to fetch Bonnie's sister Billie Jean. The idea was Billie Jean would be at least of some comfort to Bonnie while she lay in pain without proper medical attention. On the way out of Dallas, Clyde's car was spotted by Deputy Ted Hinton, who gave chase but was quickly outpaced by Clyde's newly stolen V8. Clyde and Billie Jean arrived back in Arkansas to find Bonnie's leg had slightly healed and scabs were forming. Grim. Also, they had to get a doctor who's just like, yeah, here's some barbiturates. They're robbers. Why not just go into a pharmacy and be like, yo, give me the good shit? On June the 23rd, Clive sent Ivan and Jones out to do some robberies for spending money. They targeted a grocery store in Fayetteville. The take was $20, or $470 in today's money. Ivan and Jones were pursued by Town Marshal Henry Humphrey and Deputy Red Sailors. In their haste to escape, Ivan and Jones crashed their getaway car. They watched the two officers approach. Humphrey was armed with a .38 revolver, Sailors with an old 7-shot Winchester rifle. Ivan and Jones got out of the wreck. Ivan had a shotgun. Jones had a Browning automatic rifle. Ivan blasted Humphrey into a ditch. The man died of his wounds 3 days later. Jones sprayed bullets at Sailors, who took cover behind his car. The bullets pierced through it, so Sailors made a run for it to a nearby farmhouse. Jones loaded another clip and fired again, but he missed. Then Jones and Ivan ran toward Sailor's bullet-riddled car. Sailors spun around and fired off a few shots with his Winchester, blowing the tips off 2 of Jones's fingers. Oh, I mean, yeah, good. Kim. Since the cops would soon be looking for Sailor's car, Ivan and Jones stopped a pair of newlyweds on the road and hijacked their vehicle. Nevertheless, they encountered a roadblock just outside of Fort Smith and were forced to abandon the car and sneak their way toward the cabin on foot. They arrived at 10 p.m. The Barrow gang knew immediately they had to flee. After some delay in trying and failing to steal a second car, all 6 of them crammed into the only car they had left, a small Ford coupe, and drove into the Ozark Mountains. And everyone's going to be in the comments, Simon, it's coupe. It's coupe. It's not coupe. It's coupes where you keep chickens, as Jeremy Clarkson once said. It's a coupe. They had to abandon most of their guns in order to fit into the vehicle. On June the 6th, the gang stole a doctor's medical bag from outside a hospital in Enid, Oklahoma. The bag contains morphine to keep Bonnie sedated during the bumpy car journey and sulfates to treat her burns. Meanwhile, Billie Jean had taken to cleaning and bandaging William Jones's mangled fingers, developing a bit of a crush on him. Oh, Bill, your missing fingers, just do it for me. The budding romance was cut short, however, when Clyde gave Billie Jean some money and put her on a train back to Dallas. The remaining gang members stole a large vehicle that could more comfortably hold the 5 of them, and they fled into Colorado, spending the 4th of July in the town of Pueblo. On July the 7th, they were back in Enid, Oklahoma, where they robbed another arsenal of the National Guard. Guys, look after your guns better. Coming away with a dozen Browning automatic rifles, a huge collection of pistols and revolvers, and several crates of ammunition. You're giving them the arsenal of a army. What the hell? National Guard, get your shit together. They spent the next 3 days deep in the countryside doing target practice. They then moved on through Kansas and Iowa. By mid-July, Bonnie's wounds were healed, but the leg was permanently damaged. Its tendons and muscles had tightened up, making it difficult to extend her leg and walk on it for any lengthy duration. Most of the time she hopped around, or Clyde carried her, including taking her on and off the toilet. Honestly, Bonnie, it's pretty much a miracle you survived. You got burned to the bone with acid in the 1930s and didn't see a doctor. It's a miracle that you didn't get an infection and die. On July the 18th, the Barrow gang robbed 3 gas stations in a single day in Fort Dodge, Iowa for a take of $150 or $3,500 today. That evening, they reached Platte City, Missouri, where Clyde wanted to find a motel so Bonnie could spend the night lying in a bed. They pulled into the parking lot at the Red Crown Tavern, which had a couple of tourist cabins next to it. They ultimately decided to relax there for 2 nights. Unfortunately, the Barrow gang picked a bad spot. The Red Crown's owner, Neil Hauser, was already suspicious of them. Blanche, scandalously clad in tight-fitting riding breeches, said that they were a party of 3, but then proceeded to order meals and drinks for 5. They'd also backed their car into the garage, which Hauser speculated that criminals did for a fast getaway. Yeah, that's how spies park. I was listening to, I think it was a podcast with like a former spy or something like that, and they were like, and it was like, did you take from like your everyday life into the spy world, or spy world into your everyday life? And they're like, always reverse into parking spots. And it's like, why? So you can make a quick exit. And it's like, how is that useful in real life? But now I'm always backing my car into parking spaces in case I need to make a quick exit. From nothing. There's no reason. The Red Crown Tavern was a watering hole for the local law. Oh no, you're a gang. And you're like, let's go to this pub. And you walk inside and it's just cops. And they all just turn and look at you like, evening. It's like, Just going to slowly back away. And at noon on the 19th, Hauser related his suspicions to some highway patrolmen who were having lunch there. By 3 p.m., the local law had determined that the stranger's car was stolen, and their physical descriptions matched those of the Barrow gang. At 1 a.m. on the 20th of July, a posse of 13 lawmen mustered at the Red Crown Tavern equipped with Tommy guns and thick metal bullet shields. They blocked Clyde's stolen V8 in the garage with an armoured car. I would feel like this is the end, right? How are they going to get out of this one? But we're only like 3/4 of the way through the episode, so it's a long episode. It's a super long episode. And Bonnie and Clyde die in a shootout, right? I'm not spoiling anything. It's Bonnie and Clyde. Wait, or do they drive a car off a cliff? Is that Bonnie and Clyde? Who drives a car off a cliff? Oh, I don't know. Maybe there is a... I assume they're like, no spoilers, it's Bonnie and Clyde. Realizing I don't actually know the ending to Bonnie and Clyde. I know they die. Everyone knows they die. They die, right? Then two officers approached Blanche and Ivan's cabin and hammered on the door. Ivan began firing with a Browning automatic rifle through the cabin window, and Clyde and Jones did the same from the cabin next door. The shields deflected the bullets, but nevertheless the cops were forced to pull back. Sheriff Holt Coffey was struck in the neck by friendly fire from behind but kept shooting. Jones exited the cabin through a door connecting the garage and started the car, while Clyde came in and opened the garage door. Clyde fired on the armoured car, managing to pierce the plating and wounding the driver, George Highfill. Highfill panicked and backed the armoured car away, giving the V8 a clear path for escape. Bonnie, Clyde and Jones immediately jumped into the V8. You've just escaped 13 armed police officers. It's kind of impressive. Ivan and Blanche, however, needed to exit their own cabin through the front door and make it toward the others. They ran directly into machine gun fire. A bullet passed through Ivan's left temple and exited through his forehead, shattering part of his skull and exposing his brain. Ivan collapsed. Surprise! From the V8, Jones opened up with Browning to provide covering fire. Blanche, bullets whizzing around her, picked up Ivan and dragged him toward the car. Clyde helped put him in. Then Clyde sped off out of Red Crown parking lot, the V8 being pelted by machine gun bullets the entire time. One bullet struck the back passenger window, sending glass shards flying into Blanche's eyes, blinding her. Ivan was bleeding profusely, but remained conscious. He tried to comfort Blanche, saying his wound wasn't that bad. At 5 a.m., they stopped at a gas station just north of Kansas City, Missouri to refuel, but when the attendants saw the bullet-riddled car and Ivan in the blood-soaked back seat, Clyde sped away. They drove into Iowa. It's going to be hard to film. Why is your car covered in bullet holes? They drove into Iowa, where they managed to get some gas and purchase bandages, antiseptic fluid, and aspirin without the station owner getting a good look at the car. Blanche bought a pair of sunglasses to hide her eyes. Her right eye had regained some vision. Yeah, I was going to say it blinded her. Does that mean like a flashbang will blind you, but not permanently? There's a big difference. Real big difference. Clyde poured hydrogen peroxide directly into the hole in Ivan's skull in a stupid attempt to disinfect it, and then bandaged his head up. Are you smoking crack? For one. And two, how the f*** is Ivan still alive? That night, the gang set up camp at an abandoned amusement park outside the town of Dexter, which was appropriately named Dexfield Park. Clyde and Jones dug a grave for Ivan, but he was still alive on the morning of the 21st. Oh man, it's like, hey Clyde, what are you up to out there? Oh, just digging a grave. Whose grave? Just yours, just in case. Okay. Bonnie and Clyde decided to risk going into Dexter for supplies, while Jones remained behind guarding Blanche and Ivan. Ivan's brain was starting to swell, and Blanche had a shard of glass jutting out of her left eye, which Bonnie had failed to remove with a pair of tweezers. Jones whined that he was done with the outlaw life and wanted to go home. Yeah, Jones. Really? You are you? It gets a little tough, huh? Blanche and Ivan, who were drifting in and out of consciousness, told him to go since he was the only gang member that hadn't yet been identified, but Jones didn't dare bring this up with Clyde and was too frightened to just abandon the gang without Clyde's say-so. Bonnie and Clyde came back with clothing, medical supplies, and food, having aroused no suspicion in town. The Barrow gang stayed in the abandoned amusement park for 3 days, doing a daily food run, while Ivan clung to life. Jesus Christ, shot in the head, and then had acid poured into his brain hole. Jesus. On the 23rd, a local farmhand found some bloody bandages near their camp and went into Dexter to inform the local sheriff. The sheriff, in turn, went out to Dexfield to spy on the gang with a pair of binoculars. He passed on their physical descriptions to the county sheriff's office, who passed along those descriptions to the Des Moines Police Department and the National Guard. They quickly came to the conclusion that this was the Barrow gang. On the evening of July the 23rd, Clyde resolved to bring Ivan home to Cumy and get Blanche back to Dallas at the same time. Because their current Ford V8 was conspicuously riddled with bullet holes, Clyde and Jones drove to the town of Perry and stole another one. Their plan was to drive back to Texas the next morning, but that was the morning a veritable army composed of 12 lawmen and 40 trigger-happy townsfolk planned to attack. Oh my lord, that's 52 armed people. Good luck getting out of that one, no matter how many Browning guns you have. On July the 24th, 1933, dawn broke upon Dexfield Park, accompanied by the sound of gunfire. Clyde and Jones returned fire on the 52-man militia with their Brownings, but were quickly overwhelmed. Jones was hit in the face with shotgun pellets. Clyde was shot in the left arm, while a shotgun pellet slashed through the left side of his face. The Barrow gang piled into the freshly stolen V8. Clyde tried to ram the car through the approaching men, but slammed right into a tree stump. Clyde and Jones got out and provided covering fire for Blanche, Ivan, and Bonnie as they made their way to the old bullet-riddled V8. Some of the militiamen opened fire on the second car, completely totaling it. The Barrow gang then ran away on foot, with Clyde and Jones dropping the heavy Brownings and returning fire with pistols. They'd barely made it a few yards when Ivan passed out from the strain of moving. Yeah, he's got a hole in his brain. Clyde and Jones dragged a limping Bonnie down toward the river, while Blanche stayed with her husband. Ivan woke up, told Blanche to run, and then opened fire with his pistol on the advancing militia. He was shot several times in return and lapsed into unconsciousness. Blanche did not attempt to flee. They were grabbed by militia and taken to a hospital for treatment. The admitting doctor asked Ivan where he was wanted by the law, to which Ivan replied, quote, "Everywhere I've been." Doctor be like, "So, what seems to be the problem?" "Well, I've got a hole in my brain." Ivan went in for emergency surgery, but it was no use, and he died 5 days later, having already clung to life for an exceptionally long time. Blanche was treated for her eye wounds, regaining the sight in her right eye, but ultimately her left eye remained blind. Yeah, she had a piece of glass sticking out of it. Holy... On July the 30th, Blanche was personally interrogated by J. Edgar Hoover. As in later President J. Edgar Hoover. Wow. Blanche claims that Hoover threatened to gouge out her remaining good eye if she didn't tell him where Bonnie and Clyde were. On September the 4th, Blanche pled guilty to attempted murder for her role in the shootout in Platte City, although she'd never fired a shot, and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. I have to say, she got off quite lightly. Meanwhile, back on June the 24th at Dexfield Park, Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones made it across the river and managed to shake their pursuers. They headed to a nearby farmhouse owned by the Feller family. Clyde held them at gunpoint, and what the family didn't know is that the gun Clyde was pointing at them had already run out of bullets. Clyde commandeered the Feller's car, which had no gas in the tank, so they filled it full of kerosene. Clyde got the car 65 kilometers or 40 miles away to Polk City before crashing it into a telephone pole. Clyde has an ability to crash cars. Isn't this like the fourth car he's crashed? Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones then found another Ford V8 and drove it as far as Broken Bow, Nebraska. 3 out of the 5 gang members had gotten away by the skin of their teeth. 1 was dead, another arrested. The Dexter militia suffered no fatalities and only 1 minor injury. Kind of amazing they got away again. How they keep getting away? The bright lights of Eastern Prison Farm. Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones headed into Colorado, then did an arc into Minnesota, then Illinois, before eventually heading south again into Mississippi. They kept in funds by the usual rural and small-town robberies. On August the 20th, they robbed a National Guard armory in Illinois. They were now sufficiently equipped with Brownings, pistols, and ammunition again. National Guard! Again! Get your shit together! It's the 3rd time! Jones finally plucked up the courage to tell Clyde he was done with being an outlaw. Clyde did not get angry and even gave Jones advice on what he should say to the police if they ever arrest him. Quote, "Say I forced you to do it. It worked for Bonnie last year." On September the 7th, Bonnie and Clyde dropped off William Jones in Dallas. Jones made tracks to Houston, where his mother was now living. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde headed off to a rather grim rendezvous with the Barrow and Parker clans. Ivan was dead, distressing Henry and Cumy Barrow. Bonnie's leg was permanently injured and disfigured, angering her mother, Emma. Bonnie and Clyde asked for some basic supplies and then left. They lived in abandoned farmhouses outside Dallas for the next few days, while Clyde headed into the city in order to recruit new gang members when they should probably have been thinking about skipping the country. Mexico was right there. It's like, yeah, Back in the day, they seemed to struggle to communicate across state lines. If you go to Mexico, it's just like margaritas for you forever. Due to Clyde's celebrity, only enhanced by the newspaper's flattering accounts of the shootouts in Joplin, Platte City, and Dexfield, recruiting was still easy. Two thugs named Henry Massendale and Doc Porter signed up right away. Clyde was a living legend in their eyes, not a desperate fugitive, barely keeping one step out of the law. The gang headed into Oklahoma with the intent of committing some lucrative robberies there, only get chased by the police, with Clyde and Potter getting away and Massendale getting beaten to a pulp by two old ladies with croquet mallets when he tried to hijack their car. Legends. They beat the shit out of him with croquet mallets. Massendale got 20 years for armed robbery. When Porter and Clyde got back to Dallas, they immediately dissolved their partnership. Bonnie and Clyde, it wasn't working out very well. Bonnie and Clyde lay low on the outskirts of Dallas for most of October and November. Meanwhile, in Houston, on November the 16th, William Jones was identified as a member of the Barrow gang and picked up by police. He was transferred to Dallas County Jail, where he was questioned by Ted Hinton and Bob Alcorn. They bought Jones's story that Clyde had forced him to come along. Jones cut a deal with the Dallas police to plead guilty for the murder of Deputy Malcolm Davis at the McBride shootouts, even though he had been killed by Clyde, in exchange for not being extradited to Arkansas, where punishments were harsher for the murder of Town Marshal Humphreys, who had been killed by Ivan. Ultimately, Jones was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the Davis murder. Again, getting off pretty lightly. I thought they would cook him for that one. On November the 21st, Kumi Barrow's 59th birthday, the Barrow and Parker clans met Bonnie and Clyde and threw a party for her in the isolated rural community of Sowers, just northeast of Dallas. Clyde felt bad that he had not bought his mother a present, so he told everyone to come back to Sowers the following night for another party. On November the 22nd, the Barrow and Parker families went to Sowers and waited for Bonnie and Clyde to arrive. Unfortunately, either Billie Jean Parker or Marie Barrow's boyfriend, Joe Francis, had turned informant, and Sheriff Smoot Schmid, which is such a strange name. His name's Smoot. And he was surveilling the rendezvous point with Ted Hinton, Bob Alcorn, and Ed Castor. They were armed to the teeth. Good idea, boys. Bonnie and Clyde approached in yet another stolen Ford V8, but sped past the rendezvous point as a precaution. Sheriff Schmid jumped to his feet and shouted, "Halt!" And the Dallas cops began shooting at the V8, which was peppered with bullets, wounding both Bonnie and Clyde in the legs. But they managed to get away. Bonnie and Clyde are a mess, especially Bonnie's legs. Bonnie's like, "It's always my legs, Clyde. Why my legs, Clyde?" Bonnie and Clyde drove into downtown Dallas, where they staggered out of the V8 and hijacked a fresh car at gunpoint. After transferring their possessions to the new vehicle, they sped out of Dallas and headed to Oklahoma, where they bribed a corrupt doctor to treat their leg wounds without informing the police. While in Oklahoma, they tried to hook up with a fellow gangster, Pretty Boy Floyd, but he wasn't home and his wife turned them away. Floyd had nothing but contempt for Bonnie and Clyde, stating that they were too reckless with gunplay around innocent bystanders. Good for you, Pretty Boy. Bonnie and Clyde returned to the outskirts of Dallas on November the 29th, where they stayed in an abandoned farmhouse again, frequently heading into town to set up secret meetings with their families. They stayed around Dallas for all of December. They appeared to be completely broken by the disastrous events of the past few months. Then, on January the 13th, 1934, Floyd Hamilton, Ray Hamilton's older brother, got a message to Clyde about a plan to bust Ray out of Eastern Prison Farm. The plan was actually entirely of Ray's concoction, transmitted to Floyd via ex-convict James Mullen, who got out of Easton 3 days earlier. Clyde was reluctant to partake in the raid, but Bonnie talked him into it, saying that with Ray Hamilton back in the fold, they could hit another bank. From this point forward, Bonnie took an increasingly aggressive role in their criminal activities, perhaps as a result of a now full-time guzzling of hard liquor. At 2 a.m. on January the 14th, Floyd and Mullen snuck out to Eastham and concealed two .45 caliber pistols in a tire under a small bridge on prison property. On the 15th, the guns were retrieved by Eastham prisoner Fred Yost and given to Joe Palmer, who stashed them in his cell. Bro, you got a gun into prison? Holy shit. Bonnie, Clyde, and Mullen headed down to Eastham that night. Shortly after dawn on the 16th, two teams of prisoners were clearing brush and stacking firewood in a forest near the road. Joe Palmer walked up to one of the mounted prison guards, Major Krausen, and shot him in the stomach. Ray Hamilton, with the second .45, shot Olin Bozeman in the hip. Then Hamilton and Palmer ran toward the road, joined by Hilton Bybee, who had signed up to the escape plan, and two random prisoners simply seizing the opportunity, Henry Methvin and J.B. French. Didn't we have Henry Methvin earlier? Wasn't there a Methvin? I feel like we had a Methvin. Waiting at the road in a black Ford V8, surprise, Clyde pressed down on the car horn to guide the escapees to the vehicle, while Bonnie exited the car and laid down some suppression fire into the treetops with a Browning automatic rifle to intimidate any other mounted guards from following the convicts too closely. The V8 could only hold 5 passengers, but there were 8 men, J.B. French continued running past the car on foot, only to be recaptured a few days later. Hamilton and Palmer had jumped into the car with Bonnie, Clyde and Mullen, with Bybee and Methven hanging on for dear life on the outside. They drove to the small town of Rome and placed a call to the Barrow residents telling Elsie and Floyd to bring some civilian clothes. They arrived, the escapees changed out of their prison overalls, and Mullen departed with Floyd and Elsie. The escapees, Hamilton, Palmer, Bybee and Methven, remained with Bonnie and Clyde. At a stroke, the Barrow gang had been reconstituted. The return of the Wild West. Prison guard Olin Bozeman ultimately recovered from his gunshot wounds, while Major Crowson lingered in agony until he died on January the 27th, 1934. Before he passed, Crowson begged the general manager of Huntsville Prison, Lee Simmons, to track down the man who shot him and send him to the electric chair. It was Joe Palmer who had killed Major Crowson, but Lee Simmons' sights were set on Clyde Barrow as the root of the problem. Simmons was frustrated with the failure of law enforcement to capture Bonnie and Clyde. He wanted them to be tracked relentlessly across the country and killed on the spot when they were found. Put down like dogs, just like what happened in the days of the Wild West. Yeah, they have really brought back the Wild West, so I'd be fine with that. Yeah, a little bit of extrajudicial killing. Why not? They deserve it. Simmons wanted frontier justice, not city justice. Yes, Simmons, yes! Thus he turned to Captain Frank Hamer, a former Texas Ranger, telling him, quote, "I want you to put them on the spot and shoot everyone in sight." Gangster. The reputation of the Texas Rangers is well deserved, for both good and ill. You do not with the Texas Rangers. They arose in the 1830s out of a life and death struggle with the Comanche, easily the most powerful, ruthless, and feared Native American tribe on the continent. That's not an overstatement. Descending from the mountains of Wyoming in the early 1700s, the Comanche terrorized settlers and other native tribes in Texas for 150 years as an unstoppable force of mounted archers and spearmen. They were tactically superior to Spanish, Mexican, Texan, and other Native American forces until the introduction of the Colt revolver in 1851 and the Winchester repeater, my personal favorite, in 1866. This gave the Rangers a fighting chance in mounted combat, where single-shot and muzzle-loading weapons were too slow to keep pace with Comanche arrows and spears. Out of that crucible, the Rangers went on to fight white outlaws with a very much shoot-first, ask-questions-later type of approach. They were also fond of extra-legal summary executions rather than taking prisoners. These were the days of the Wild West, where justice came rough and ready. When the Mexican Revolution broke out in 1910, the Rangers employed similar brutality on the border. Some of this involved tracking and killing Mexican outlaws and revolutionaries who were robbing and murdering people in U.S. territory. But the brutal border war often led to indiscriminate killing of innocent men of Mexican descent, some of whom had lived in Texas as American citizens their entire lives. The 1919 Canales investigation destroyed the Rangers' reputation and saw their numbers reduced from 1,000 men to just 68. In 1930, this number was further reduced to 45. In 1932, most of the Rangers resigned or were fired. This brutal relic of the Wild West, it was argued, had no place in a more civilized age. This was a random aside that I thoroughly enjoyed, learning all about Texas Rangers. But it is exactly that reputation for relentlessness and brutality that prompted Lee Simmons to hire Captain Frank Hamer. Born in 1884 and joining the Texas Rangers in 1906, Hamer was a legendary figure in the dying days of the Wild West. Standing at 6'2" and 190 pounds or 86 kilos, Hamer was a veteran of 52 shootouts, slayer of 53 men, a first-class marksman and an expert tracker. Oh my god, I'd be terrified. It's like we're putting Hamer on it. He's killed 52 people! 53 people! He had over a dozen bullets lodged in his torso, surgically unremovable. Jesus! From 1906 to 1908, Hamer patrolled 1,000 miles of the Mexican border, famously tracking down several murderous outlaws in just 2 years. One of his most legendary actions was putting down livestock rustler and multiple murderer Ed Putnam during a standoff at a bordello. Putnam had come to cover the window and just slightly nudged the curtain, and that was enough for Hamer to snipe him, no scope, with a Winchester repeater, sending a bullet through his neck. In 1908, this dude's a badass. In 1908, Hamer became the marshal of the outlaw-infested town of Navasota, which prior to his arrival had 50 murders a year in a population of just 3,500. Oh my god, the past! That's insane! At just age 24, Hamer crushed the outlaws in the town and restored order. From 1911 to 1914, he sheriffed in various counties, tracking down murderers and cattle rustlers, until he rejoined the Texas Rangers in 1915. He was leader of a battalion in the Bandit Wars against Mexican smugglers and revolutionaries, surviving several gun battles. Yeah, he's got 12 bullets inside his body. He definitely survived some gun battles. Hammer once told his men, "We're here to enforce the law, and the best way to do that is a 45 slug in the gut." This guy's, again, badass. In 1917, he married wealthy widow Gladys Sims, and in true Texas style, the nuptials were accompanied by a gun battle with the extended family of Gladys's first husband, during which Hammer was wounded. Oh my god, I thought that was a joke. It's not. During the 1919 investigation into misconduct by the Texas Rangers, Hammer stalked and threatened violence against the chief investigator, Joseph Canales, if he didn't back off. Whoa. Steady on. You could definitely call Hammer morally grey. At best, you could say that he was loyal to the Rangers to a fault. In 1921, Hammer joined a Prohibition unit that was beset by a bloody ambush in El Paso, during which Prohibition agent Ernest Walker was killed. Thereafter, Hammer became senior captain of the Texas Rangers among the 68 men who remained in service. In 1922, Hammer went to war against the Texas Ku Klux Klan and rescued 15 black men from lynchings. This guy is definitely morally grey. It's like, he's doing really good but then he's also like, you investigate me? You better back the off. I kind of like this guy overall. In 1928, Hammer exposed the murder for hiring set up by the Texas Bankers Association. Oh my god, the past! It's like, it's murder for hire just done by bankers. In 1930, during the Sherman riots, he tried and failed to prevent the lynching of George Hughes when a mob of people attacked the courthouse where he was being held. Hammer shot and wounded 2 in the angry mob, but the crowd set fire to the courthouse and used dynamite to blow up in the vault where Hughes was being concealed. Hammer resigned from the Texas Rangers in 1932, refusing to serve under Governor Miriam Marr Ferguson, whose corrupt husband, Jimmy Parr Ferguson, had been impeached. Parr got Marr to run instead, so he could rule from behind the scenes. Some Texas Rangers resigned with Hammer, and Marr fired the rest, effectively ending them as a force. And now, 2 years later, Lee Simmons had hired Frank Hammer to kill Bonnie and Clyde, giving him the cumbersome but vaguely useful job title of Special Escape Investigator for the Texas prison system. The wage wasn't great, $2,160 or $49,000 per year in modern money, and God forbid Hammer take a year to track down Bonnie and Clyde, but Simmons threw in a sweetener. Hammer, and whoever participated in the killing of Bonnie and Clyde, would get the $26,000 reward put together by law organizations and private sources. That's over 10 times his yearly salary, assuming we're talking about old dollars. Yes, because it's $595,000 in today's money. Oh my god, that is a proper bounty. Furthermore, Hammer would be, why does he even need the salary? Just be like, yeah, I'll do it for the bounty. I'll go hunt those down, dead or alive. I want that $600,000. Furthermore, Hammer would be allowed to take whatever personal effects from Bonnie and Clyde he pleased, which would sell for a fortune due to their immense fame and the high prices usually assigned to criminal memorabilia. Ultimately, however, it wasn't the money that induced Hammer. Bonnie and Clyde were outlaws. They were killers, and tracking down and executing killers is just what Frank Hammer did. Thus, Bonnie and Clyde's days were numbered. As Hammer's fellow captain in the Texas Rangers, Bill McDonald, once said, "No man in the wrong can stand up against a fella that's in the right and keeps on a-comin'." No honor among thieves. On January the 23rd, 1934, a mere week after the Eastham jailbreak, Ray Hamilton and Hilton Bybee entered the First National Bank in Rembrandt, Iowa, pointed a gun at the clerk, and walked away with $3,800 or $87,000 in modern money. Clyde Barrow was the getaway driver with Henry Methvin beside him. Joe Palmer was, this got to be their biggest take yet, right? They had some pretty big ones. I think 35 grand was the biggest, 87 all in modern money. It's a proper amount of money. Clyde Barrow was the getaway driver with Henry Methvin beside him. Joe Palmer was ill and curled up in the fetal position in the backseat. Bonnie was back at the motel. Clyde pissed off Ray Hamilton by splitting the take 6 ways when he thought it should have been 4. Hamilton owed James Mullen $1,000 for helping him break out of Easton, and 6 ways left him nowhere near clearing his debt. This did not bode well for Ray Hamilton, staying on with the gang. Hilton Bybee, meanwhile, took his share of the loot and immediately left the gang, lighting out for Amarillo, where he was recaptured on January the 31st and returned to Easton Prison Farm. On January the 26th, 1934, the Barrow gang robbed a bank in Poteau, Oklahoma. Hamilton, Methvin, Palmer were the triggermen, and Clyde Barrow was again at the wheel. Their take, why would Clyde be at the wheel? Clyde seems to crash cars all the time. Their take was $1,500 or $34,000 a day, and from there the gang headed to San Antonio, Texas to visit Palmer's sister Faye. Along the way, Hamilton and Palmer quarreled. Hamilton actually tried to shoot Palmer when the latter was asleep in the car, but Clyde turned around, slapped the gun out of Hamilton's hand, and in doing so lost control of the car and ran into a ditch. Of course he did, he's Clyde. He barely knows how to drive, apparently. Thereafter, a tense truce reigns. Leaving San Antonio, the gang headed for Houston, where Palmer met an attorney had bribed to track down a fellow named Wade McNabb, an ex-convict who had terrorized Palmer when they were both at Easton. Palmer wanted to find McNabb and kill him. Oh man, the gang dropped Palmer off in Joplin, Missouri on January the 30th and wished him good luck and happy hunting, making plans to meet up later. Good luck, happy hunting! People, you're hunting a man. On February the 1st, the Barrow gang robbed the State Savings Bank in Conerum, Iowa. Clyde and Hamilton were the triggermen, grabbing money from a cash drawer and robbing a customer and getting shot at by one of the tellers on the way out the door. The take was $300 or $7,000 today. From there, the gang drove south to Bienville Parish in Louisiana, where they had visited Henry Methin's family. After a couple of days, they headed north again into Missouri, where on February the 12th, they stole a car in Springfield, only to get chased by the cops. These guys are nuts. If I was in this position, you just rob 87 grand or whatever it was in today's money. Just do a couple more of those, get in a stolen car, go down to Mexico and just be like, that's it. I guess we have to stop our crimes. Or until you get bored or whatever, because you're going to get in trouble. And you're all sorts of up with the bullet holes and the burnt leg down to the bone. It's not a good time. Maybe they find it a good time. I think they just like it. They get a kick out of it, right? It's not going to be about the money anymore. Clyde shook the pursuit, but then got lost in the Missouri countryside. They pulled over in Reed Spring and kidnapped bystander Joe Gunn and demanded that he guide them to Arkansas. Gunn noted that Bonnie was drunk, cussed a lot, and was armed with a Browning automatic rifle. Indeed, she'd become quite skilled with the horrendously powerful machine gun and wielded it regularly. She was soon to use it. The gang hit a police roadblock outside Reed Spring, and along with Methvin and Hamilton, Bonnie showered the cop cars with bullets as Clyde sped past. They did the same thing to a cop car by the roadside a few hours later. Finally, the gang pulled into Berryville, Arkansas, and they gave Joe Gunn $10 and let him go. This is such a strange thing. Why? You're terrible criminals. On February the 13th, the gang dropped off Hamilton in Amarillo, Texas, making plans to meet up later, while Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin headed to Dallas to rendezvous with the Parker and Barrow clans. That night, they enjoyed a fairly happy time with their families, distributing the proceeds of their recent bank robberies. The gang stayed in the Dallas area, camping in the woods and in abandoned farmhouses. On February the 18th, Hamilton arrived in Dallas with an Amarillo prostitute named Mary Adair. Mary was a pain in the ass and demanded they leave camp and go drinking in fancy clubs. People like, Hamilton, what the fuck, man? Why did you bring Mary? Clyde and Bonnie tried to explain why this wasn't possible, especially not in Dallas, but Ray Hamilton felt obligated to take Mary's side, causing a great deal of friction in the group. Oh, Hamilton, you're thinking with your penis here. Mary and Hamilton went off drinking on their own. Bonnie and Clyde were uneasy. They didn't trust Mary not to go running to the cops at the first opportunity, but in order to keep Hamilton happy, they bit their tongues. Not a good idea. I get the feeling this could turn out badly. On February the 20th, the Barrow gang robbed the state guard. Fourth time state guard! Are you kidding me? In Ranger, Texas, taking away 4 Brownings, 13 Colt 45s, and several crates of ammunition. What the f***? On February the 27th, the gang hit the R.P. Henry and Sons Bank in Dallas. Their takeaway was $4,176 or 96 grand in modern money. Oh, guys, you gotta go. You must have at least 200 grand in cash right now. Just flee. It's time to flee. It's time to go to Lebanon. Notably, on the way out the door, Clyde returned $27 to Dallas laborer Oliver Worley, who had just cashed his paycheck, saying, "You worked like hell for this, didn't you? We don't want your money, just the banks." The gang got into the getaway car and headed north out of Dallas. Clyde told Hamilton to split the money 4 ways. Clyde, Bonnie, Methvin, and Hamilton. Mary Adair didn't get a share. Of course she didn't. She's just an annoying tag-along. Hamilton disagreed, pointing out that Mary did as much as Bonnie during the robbery, aka nothing. Clyde told him to shut up and split the money, then caught Hamilton trying to stuff $600 from the take in his coat to give to Mary later. Well, look, Hamilton, if you want to split some of your money with Mary, go ahead. But why should the others have to do that? You brought her along and she turned out to be annoying. Clyde stopped the vehicle, forced Hamilton out of the car, and demanded he give the money back. Hamilton complied. Good idea, Hamilton. Clyde's a psycho. It made for a very tense trip up to Terre Haute, Indiana. Once they arrived, Hamilton and Mary witnessed Bonnie and Clyde having an argument. Seeing an opportunity, Mary tried to convince Bonnie to dose Clyde with sleeping pills, steal all his money, and take off with her and Hamilton. Bonnie immediately told Clyde, who expelled Mary and Hamilton from the gang. Whoa. I'm surprised he didn't just kill you, Mary. Mary, you're pretty dumb. I don't like you, Mary. Mary and Hamilton stole a car and slunk off to Texas with their tails between their legs. Honestly, you should just be happy you're still alive. In early March, Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin returned to Bienville Parish in Louisiana to visit Methvin's family again. The Methvins of Bienne Parish were a numerous bunch, a whole gaggle of aunts, uncles, and cousins who dwelt in snake-ridden forests and gator-infested marshlands. Henry Methvin's father, Ivy, was a chair craftsman, freight hauler, and probable bootlegger who had fallen on hard times in the Depression. He was an alcoholic and generally disliked in the area. His wife, Ava Methvin, wasn't much better and had a reputation for leeching off of her neighbors. Their boy, Henry, had left home in 1930 at the age of 18 and had been hitchhiking in Texas when he slashed a man's throat and stole his car. Oh, it's the Wild f***ing West! The victim survived, but Henry got done for assault with intent to murder and car theft, resulting in a 10-year sentence at Easton Prison Farm. I'm surprised he didn't get more. He tried to murder someone. Slashing someone's throat is not something you do to injure them. Henry Methvin had always maintained that the victim had tried to sexually assault him, and he was just defending himself. What, you would try to steal his car, he sexually assaults you, and then you try to kill him? Yeah, right. Ivy and Ava Methvin believed their son and were trying to get Henry pardoned by Ma Ferguson, the governor of Texas, when Bonnie and Clyde busted him out, completely ruining Methvin's chance of being paroled and going straight. Thus, Ivy and Ava Methvin felt absolutely no gratitude to Bonnie and Clyde for turning their son into a wanted fugitive. What was more ambiguous was Henry Methvin's attitude toward Bonnie and Clyde. Since the breakout in January, Methvin had followed Clyde's orders to the letter and was always respectful to Bonnie. In fact, Clyde was starting to think of Methvin as a loyal henchman, relying on him more and more. Yet in the week of the gang's second visit to Bienville Parish, Henry Methvin approached his mother, Ava, in secret. He told her that running with Bonnie and Clyde was likely to get him killed sooner or later. Methvin asked his mother to get word to law enforcement, offering to set Bonnie and Clyde up to be killed or captured the next time they visited Bienville Parish in exchange for Henry Methvin being pardoned for the attempted murder charge in 1930. It's a pretty solid negotiation right there. The Barrow gang departed Bienville in mid-March, and Methvin's father, Ivy, secretly arranged to meet Bienville Sheriff Henderson Jordan, where Ivy told the sheriff about his son's offer. Jordan replied that as a Louisiana sheriff, he couldn't promise a pardon on behalf of the state of Texas, but he would talk to the relevant authorities. 2 days later in Shreveport, Sheriff Jordan met Frank Hammer representing the Texas prison system, Special Agent Lester Kindle representing J. Edgar Hoover, and Dallas Deputy Sheriff Bob Alcorn representing, Dallas, to discuss Methvin's offer. They were all in agreement. The state of Texas would pardon Henry for attempted murder if he could give them Bonnie and Clyde. Thus, Frank Hammer started making preparations for a good old Texas Ranger-style bushwhacking. Tell them I don't smoke cigars. After leaving Bienville, Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin headed back to Dallas, where they skulked around abandoned farmhouses for a couple of weeks, meeting semi-regularly with the Parkers and the Barrows. Then on March the 27th, they left to link up with Joe Palmer again, who had finally located the man he wanted to kill in the town of Gladewater, Texas. Clyde decided that he would assist in this murder. Why not? Nothing like a good murder, right, Clyde? On March the 29th, they jumped McNabb while he was leaving a gambling den, cracked open his skull with a blunt instrument and shot him multiple times. Then they transported his body and dumped it on the Texas-Louisiana border. The Barrow gang, now comprised of Bonnie, Clyde, Methvin, and Palmer, headed back to Dallas on April the 1st, 1934, to rendezvous with the Parkers and the Barrows for Easter Sunday. Palmer was sent to fetch them. Bonnie had bought her mother a rabbit. She'd named it Sunny Boy. While waiting for the Barrow and Parker clans on Dove Road, just off Highway 114 near the town of Grapevine, Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin shot and killed Highway Patrol officers Edward Wheeler and Holloway Murphy. Wheeler was killed instantly by a burst from Methvin's Browning automatic rifle. Murphy, a rookie, first day on the job, was incapacitated by Clyde with a shotgun. Witness accounts differ on whether Methvin put some more bullets in Murphy to finish him off or whether Bonnie did. Either way, Murphy didn't die until he was transported to hospital half an hour later. The witness who claimed he saw Bonnie deliver the attempted coup de grace to Murphy, a farmer named William Schleifer, has been deemed an unreliable witness by some historians since then. Indeed, Schleifer's story transmogrified in the decades after the killing, casting doubt on his reliability, and in his initial statement to police and the media, he claims that Bonnie had a cigar in her mouth when she shot Murphy. This might have been embellishment, since despite posing with a cigar in a famous photograph, Bonnie didn't like them and preferred to smoke cigarettes. But regardless of whether Scheifer's account is at all truthful, the press and the public at the time sure believed it. Up until this point, Bonnie and Clyde were regarded by many as folk heroes, but the cold and callous act of Bonnie shooting an already wounded man soured public opinion. Being a female bank robber was sexy, but being a woman who slaughters a helpless 24-year-old rookie who is already disarmed and dying, not so much. What made it 1,000 times worse was the man Bonnie allegedly shot in cold blood was due to marry a woman, Marie Tullis, on April the 13th, 12 days after his murder. Tullis wore a wedding dress to Officer Murphy's funeral, and this was splashed across the newspapers, souring the public against Bonnie still further. Good. The American people had ceased to give a about how stylish Bonnie's outfits were. She was a vicious cop killer who had deprived a young bride of her husband. Good. People finally seeing her for what she is, a piece. Additionally, the Grapevine shooting on April the 1st complicated things for Frank Hammer. The state of Texas was willing to pardon Henry Methvin for an attempted murder back in 1930, but now Methvin had just gunned down a highway patrol officer and possibly shot a second one while he was bleeding on the ground. Oh, Methvin, you've done the impossible. You've got a pardon for murder. Was it murder? Yeah, sorry, attempted murder. And you're just like, you know what's better than attempted murder? Murder. Why? You got a pardon, dude. It would not be so easy to get the state of Texas to overlook 2 cop killings in order to merely have a chance at ambushing and killing Bonnie and Clyde. Hammer's response to the change in circumstances was to form a good old-fashioned posse. He recruited 38-year-old former Texas Ranger Manny Gault, who had worked with Hammer back in the 1920s fighting the Texas KKK. Next, Hammer recruited Dallas Deputy Sheriffs Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton, who knew Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker personally and could confirm their identities before the shooting started. Is it them? Yes! Over fire! Immediately after the murder of Wheeler and Murphy, the Barrow gang had raced down Highway 114 in their Ford V8. They spotted Clyde's siblings, Elsie and Marie, coming in the opposite direction to the rendezvous point at Grapevine. Clyde flagged them down and told them to turn around and stop their other family members from heading to the area. Then Clyde tore down the road away from Dallas, not risking it to retrieve Joe Palmer, who was traveling up with the Parkers. Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin kept going until they reached Oklahoma. They were followed by Hammer and his newly formed posse 2 days later, driving in 2 cars. Hammer and Gault in one, Alcorn and Hinton in the other. On April 4th, 1934, the Hammer crew had tracked Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin to Durant, Oklahoma. The posse's 2 cars were driving down Main Street when Ted Hinton, in the lead car, spotted Clyde's V8 driving in the opposite direction. Clyde was driving slowly, not aware that he'd been recognized. Hinton made the judgment call not to swing around and give chase, since there was too much traffic on Main Street and Clyde would almost certainly get away. Nor did Hinton want to initiate a gun battle with the Barrow gang in such a crowded area. So Hinton pulled over and watched Clyde's car disappear, while he flagged down Hammer and Gault to let them know what had happened. The posse got back in their cars and headed in the direction that Clyde was traveling. They tried to pick up his trail again by questioning gas station attendants and cafe waitstaff along the way, but to no avail. On April the 6th, just after midnight, the Barrow gang approached the outskirts of Commerce, Oklahoma. Clyde was tired from driving all day, and so he pulled over, and he, Bonnie, and Methvin all slept in the car together. At 9 a.m., Commerce Chief of Police Percy Boyd and Constable Cal Campbell got a report of a suspicious car parked on the state road. Boyd and Campbell drove out to investigate in a marked police car. No. I mean, yeah, because they don't really know anything. So they're just like, yeah, of course you'd go in a marked police car. I get the feeling they're going to run into some substantial trouble. Clyde was awake, his turn on watch, when he saw the cop car approach. I don't understand. Like, I've slept in my car, and it's like, you don't just park on the side of the road and be like, okay, this place looks great. You find somewhere a little quiet. You're like, well, let's just go down this little side street here. Like, I have an overland car. Like, I'm big into road trips, so I bought like a Toyota Land Cruiser, and I kitted it out with all of this like cool equipment for going on like big road trips. And I do big road trips with my mate. And like, if you're going to sleep in the car and camp in the car, it's got like a rooftop tent on it that you pop up. It's like you find somewhere like real quiet. Like you go down this little path, you drive it off road a little bit. You don't just park on the side of the highway and be like, this is good, because you're going to get into trouble. Clyde threw the car into reverse, intent on spinning around and making his escape. Unfortunately, the rain of the previous evening had turned the road into mud and the car got stuck. Oh, Clyde, you're the worst driver ever. Mildly amused, Boyd and Campbell got out of their vehicle and approached the Ford V8 on foot. Then Constable Campbell saw someone in the car brandishing a gun, so he pulled out his revolver and fired. Chief of Police Boyd, realizing the die had been cast, followed suit. Clyde and Methvin emerged from the Ford with Browning automatic rifles. Oh my god. Dudes, with your little revolvers, you have brought knives to a gunfight. Clyde took cover by the side of the Ford to shoot at the officers while Methvin full-on charged at them, zigzagging to avoid their shots. Methvin, are you on meth, you maniac? Campbell took several bullets to the chest, severing his aorta, killing him on the spot. Boyd was grazed by a bullet to the left side of the head, stunning him for long enough that Methvin was able to disarm him. Due to the hail of bullets, it's unclear whether it was Clyde or Methvin who killed Constable Campbell. In the eyes of the law, though, it doesn't matter, does it? They're both... That's both enough to get them in the chair. Several onlookers from the nearby farm had been attracted by the sound of gunfire. You know what I do when, I don't know, I've not heard gunfire, in this sort of situation. You know what I do? Don't run towards it. Stay where I am or move in the opposite direction, because it's gunfire. Clyde brandished a Browning at them and ordered the onlookers, along with Chief Boyd, to push the Ford V8 out of the mud. It took them 40 minutes to get the car free. Boyd was forced into the back. I was, it just reminds me, speaking of, overland adventures, I went on a trip with a couple of mates of mine, and we're off-roading a little bit, and I'm just cool, I'm just going to turn the car around because we've gone the wrong way. And this car's pretty capable. It's got, big mud tires on it. It's a properly capable off-road car. And I'm just let's just turn it around here. And immediately, it just sinks into the ground. And there's just a clay bog hidden underneath, grass. And the car just starts sinking and sinking and sinking. And you're okay, no worries. We'll just use the winch to get it out. The winch is, fully embedded in this clay bog. So we're digging it for ages. And eventually, we managed to find a local 4x4 club. And they come and winch us out. And it's oh, thank you. It's very lucky that you were close by. Boyd was forced into the back seat and held at gunpoint, and the gang drove off in the direction of Kansas. Not 3 miles down the road, their way was blocked by 2 farmers whose truck had also gotten stuck in the mud. Clyde and Methvin got out to help them, while Bonnie stayed in the car, pointing a shotgun in Percy Boyd's face. Then she asked to look at Boyd's head wound, expressing concern. When Clyde and Methvin cleared the farmer's truck from the road, they took off again. But after a few miles, Bonnie asked Clyde to pull over by a stream. There, she washed Boyd's head wound and applied a bandage to it. The gang drove the rest of the day, pulling into a diner in Fort Scott, Kansas at around 6 p.m. Methvin ran inside and bought them all food. During their meal, Bonnie asked Boyd, "If we are caught and killed while you are with us, would you please make sure my rabbit gets delivered to my mother?" Because Boyd's shirt was stained with his own blood, Bonnie and Clyde gave him a new one, along with a fresh tie. Gotta think about those appearances while you've got a head wound. Methvin gave Boyd his suit jacket to complete the ensemble. A few hours later, Boyd was released in the canvas countryside unharmed. Wait, didn't we say that he got shot in the head? Yeah, he had a head wound. He's hardly unharmed, David. I mean, he didn't have further harm, but a bullet grazed his head. Before the gang departed, Boyd asked them what, if anything, they'd like to tell the media. Bonnie replied, "Tell them I don't smoke cigars." The end of the line. From Fort Scott, Kansas, Clyde doubled back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the gang laid low in a house owned by the Newton brothers, notorious train robbers that Clyde had met at an unknown point during the past few years. There, Clyde got word that Ray Hamilton had denounced him in a letter to the Dallas Morning News and denied that he had anything to do with the Grapevine murders of Wheeler and Murphy. Hamilton even provided proof that he had not been in New Orleans at the time. On April the 10th, Clyde wrote a letter of his own, not to the papers, but to Henry Ford, telling him, quote, "What a dandy car you make." Ford, more hostile to Jews than to gangsters, had his secretary write a thank you note and sent it off to the General Post Office in Tulsa. Obviously, Clyde never received it. What are you doing, Henry Ford? Don't reply to gangsters who are using your cars in crimes. On April the 16th, the Barrow gang hit the First National Bank in Stewart, Iowa, coming away with $1,500 or $35,000 in modern money. Then they put Henry Methvin on a train to Dallas to arrange another rendezvous with the Parkers and Barrows. Bonnie and Clyde followed after him by car, arriving in Dallas on the 18th. At the rendezvous, Bonnie finally managed to give Sonny Boy to her mother. Oh, the rabbit. Yeah, of course. Bonnie, what are you up to? What's wrong with you? She said, "Keep him away from the cops. He's been in 2 gun battles and he'll land at Huntsville if the law finds out." I don't think they let you have pets in jail, Bonnie. During the meeting, Clyde declared that he and Bonnie would never flee to Mexico. Why? You gotta go to Mexico, come on! They wanted to keep visiting their families who were, quote, all we have left. How about your families come and visit you? So much for the glamorous outlaw life that the American public thought they led. What a fucking waste of life. Yeah, no, these people are pieces of shit, I agree. Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin spent a few more days in Dallas, visiting the Parkers and Barrow several more times before making a quick trip to Bienville Parish on April the 22nd. They didn't stay more than a few hours, but the visit allowed Ivy Methvin to tell his son, Henry, that he'd cut a deal with the law. If he could lure Bonnie and Clyde into a trap, Henry Methvin would be given a pardon for his crimes. It did not occur to Ivy that the recent cop killings in Grapevine and Commerce may have scuppered that deal. It's like, dude, you got a pardon, and now you're committing more crimes that are not covered by the pardon. You had a golden ticket out. What the A pardon is not just like no prison or a deal. It's like you have no criminal record. It's very powerful. But for all Henry Methvin knew, he finally had a way out of this whole mess. From Bienville, the gang went to Joplin, Missouri to pick up Joe Palmer. On April the 29th, they headed to Topeka, Kansas, where they stole a new Ford V8. It was tinted Cordoba gray and would go on to have a rather interesting life of its own, the writer said, raising his eyebrows suggestively. Wait, what is this foreshadowing, David? On May the 3rd, the gang arrived in Everly, Iowa, where they robbed the farmer's trust and savings bank for a take of $700 or $16,000 in modern money. From there, the Barrow gang traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to have an impromptu vacation, with the exception of Joe Palmer, who headed north to Chicago because he wanted to attend the World's Fair. What are you doing? We're taking a break. We're going on holiday. Where are you going? Oh, I want to see the World's Fair. And it's like, yeah, I guess. These people, they do crimes and then they want to have a life. Fine. This bit of whimsy probably saved his life. For now. Meanwhile, back on April the 25th, 1935, Ray Hamilton had been captured by the police after robbing a bank in Louisville, Texas. He got cornered by a series of roadblocks and surrendered without a fight. Hamilton was transported to Dallas County Jail. On May the 3rd, Clyde sent Hamilton a 4-page letter from Memphis mocking him. Quote, "Due to the fact that you offered no resistance, my sympathy is lacking. The most I can do is hope you miss the chair. The purpose of this letter is to remind you of all the dirty deals you have pulled." Clyde then went on to call Hamilton a snake with, quote, "cat ideas" for trying to shoot Joe Palmer while he was sleeping, and call him yellow for not wanting to fight the cops on several occasions. Yeah, yellow means like a coward, right? I know that from Back to the Future. He told Hamilton that he was too stupid to understand he couldn't live like a king and hoped to remain outside of prison. He also mocked Hamilton for Mary Adair, his quote-unquote prostitute sweetheart, who was too stupid to know that you couldn't go drinking in town. Yeah, Mary Adair. She is a little bit of stupidity in today's episode. In today's stupid. I'm stupid. The letter was signed, "You can never expect the least of sympathy or assistance from me. So long, Clyde Barrow." Elsewhere, Frank Hammer had been enacting a rather devilish plan. From February through April, Hammer had discreetly tracked Bonnie and Clyde across the United States, keeping his name out of the press in the hopes that he would catch up with the gang and surprise them. However, after losing them in Durant, Oklahoma, Hammer's posse took a different approach to the problem. For the rest of April, they courted widespread media attention as they stomped loudly through Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri, supposedly looking for Bonnie and Clyde, making a return to Louisiana more appealing. Meanwhile, Hammer spoke over the telephone with Bienville Sheriff Henderson Jordan about what country back road Bonnie and Clyde could be safely executed at. Hammer added that he wanted to use Ivy Methvin as bait. Ivy balked at this, but was ultimately convinced by the argument that it was his only hope of getting a pardon for his cop-killer son. Meanwhile, Hammer swung by the National Guard Armory in Dallas, and after a hell of a lot of red tape, procured just 2 Browning automatic rifles on loan. I'm surprised they had any guns left, to be honest, after they've been robbed like 70 times. Apparently, it was easier to rob them. The Brownings are added to Hammer's already significant arsenal. On May the 4th, 1934, Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin rolled back into Bienville Parish, Louisiana. It seems that Hammer's ruse had worked because the Barrow gang made no secret they were there and flaunted themselves openly to the locals who were poor and generally viewed them as heroes. Meanwhile, I know it's a bit like past was a different time and it was the Depression and all that, but these people have killed many, many innocent people. Meanwhile, the Bienville sheriff never seemed to harass them on their visits. Bienville Parish was a sleepy backwater, and Bonnie and Clyde assumed that, so long as they didn't commit any crimes in the area, Sheriff Jordan was content to leave them alone. They were sorely mistaken. On May the 6th, Bonnie and Clyde traveled to Dallas for another meeting with the Parker and Barrow clans. Henry Methvin stayed behind in Bienville. That night, Bonnie gave her mother Emma a poem that she'd written called The End of the Line. It would later be printed in newspapers across America, gaining the title The Story of Bonnie and Clyde. The poem starts out by blaming the law for turning them to a life of crime and claiming that deep down she and Clyde are actually good people. The poem ends with the lines, quote, "They don't think they're too smart or desperate. They know the law always wins. They've been shot at before, but do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To few, it'll be grief. To the law, a relief. But it's death for Bonnie and Clyde." It's not bad. It's not bad. Like, I don't know anything about poetry, but it's not bad. 16 seconds in Bienville. The next day, on the night of the 7th of May, Clyde met up with his father, Henry Barrow, again. Clyde showed Henry a suitcase full of cash, along with some deeds to some property Clyde had purchased that he wanted to sign over to his parents. Henry remarked that he didn't have a pen on him. Clyde said that was fine, they'd take care of it when he was next in town. They'd never see each other again. Bonnie and Clyde returned to Bienville Parish, where they stayed for the next 2 weeks. They spent time frequenting the local cafe, buying candy bars at the gas station for local labourers, going to picnics at Black Lake, and attending dinners at the house of Henry Methven's brother, Terrell, and his wife, Emma. During their stay, Bonnie announced to the Methvins that she was pregnant with Clyde's child. A surprising claim, considering all Bonnie's relatives thought that she was infertile. Historians are in broad agreement that this was wishful thinking on Bonnie's part. The autopsy makes no mention of it. Perhaps it was a fantasy born of the fact that Bonnie was constantly fixated on her imminent death in a shootout. A baby gave her something to live for. Or perhaps the fantasy was the result of a surfeit of spirits. The Methvin clan observed that Bonnie was drunk pretty much every time they saw her. Hammer and his posse were waiting on advance notice from Ivy Methvin of Bonnie and Clyde's arrival at a precise location so that they could set up an ambush. The problem was, Bonnie and Clyde kept their movements random, seldom declaring their movements and arranging to meet beforehand. Hammer also didn't want to launch an assault in town, or while Bonnie and Clyde were members of the Methvin family. Too many people might be killed in the crossfire, and no one, not Ivy Methvin, not even his son Henry, knew where Bonnie and Clyde set up camp at night in order to sleep. I don't know, maybe just check the sides of the roads? They seem pretty blasé about it. Meanwhile, Henry Methvin was trying to figure out how to get separated from Bonnie and Clyde without arousing their suspicion. In the end, Methvin decided to tell Clyde that should they ever be separated while in Bienville, he'd meet them back at his parents' place. Clyde trusted Methvin at this point as a loyal subordinate and took his word at face value. And this deception proved pivotal. On May the 20th, Henry Methvin told his father, Ivy, that he, Bonnie and Clyde would be heading into the city of Shreveport, Louisiana the following day. Henry told Ivy that he'd try to get separated from Bonnie and Clyde in Shreveport. Then the two would eventually come traveling up Bienville's narrow country roads to Ivy and Ava's place in order to reunite with him. On May the 21st, the trio were in Shreveport. Henry Methvin went into a cafe to get some sandwiches and sodas. While Bonnie and Clyde were waiting in the car outside, they saw a police car roll past. As a precautionary measure, Clyde pulled away from the curb and drove around the block. Henry Methvin seized the opportunity and bolted out of the cafe, stole a car, and rode hell for leather back to Bienville to let his father know that he'd given Bonnie and Clyde the slip. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde spent the rest of the day in Shreveport, apparently unworried that when they returned to the cafe, Henry was gone. They assumed he'd also seen the cop car and bolted. Bonnie and Clyde returned to Bienville Parish that evening and went to Black Lake to hang out with one of Henry's cousins, Percy, and showed him how to fire a Browning automatic rifle. Also on the evening of the 21st, Ivy Methvin contacted Sheriff Jordan and said that Bonnie and Clyde would be swinging by his place the following day to pick up Henry. Here, the entire plot ran into a pointless complication. Unbeknownst to Frank Hammer, Sheriff Jordan had also been working with the feds under Special Agent Kindle. Jordan had tried to contact the feds that evening, but hadn't gotten through. Jordan wanted another day to contact Kindle and let them know what was going on. And so, Jordan took it upon himself to tell Ivy that an ambush on the 22nd wouldn't work, and Ivy would have to stall and get Bonnie and Clyde to come back to his place on the 23rd to pick up Henry instead. This pointless delay risked Bonnie and Clyde getting spooked, or else simply having their attentions called elsewhere. On the afternoon of May 22nd, Bonnie and Clyde headed up to Ivy Methvin's place via Highway 154, a narrow, winding dirt road bordered by thick brush and hedgerows. The perfect spot for an ambush. When Bonnie and Clyde arrived at Ivy Methvin's house, Ivy came out and told them Henry wasn't there, but he'd be back the next morning. Ivy advised them to swing by at 9 a.m. Bonnie and Clyde showed no sign of being suspicious. They took off, and we don't know where they spent the rest of the 22nd. After they left, Ivy Methvin got in his rickety old truck and drove into the nearby town of Arcadia, where he informed Sheriff Jordan that Bonnie and Clyde would be returning to his place around 9 a.m. the following morning. For people who like to keep their movements random, that sounds exactly like they just set a time to show up somewhere. Jordan gave up trying to contact the feds and rang Frank Hammer, who was staying with his posse at a hotel in Shreveport. Hammer, Galt, Alcon, and Hinton got in the car and headed to Arcadia, where they met up with Sheriff Jordan and his deputy, Prentice Oakley. They briefly discussed whether they should give Bonnie and Clyde a chance to surrender before they opened fire. They decided it would be improper not to give them a chance to lay down their arms. Hammer said that he would do the honors. The men also discussed how uneasy they were to fire on a woman, but each of them, even Ted Hinton, who had once been infatuated with Bonnie, in the restaurants, admitted that they could not discriminate by sex. Merely a second's hesitation might give Clyde an opportunity to speed away or cut one of them down. Then the men discussed how to get Clyde to slow down at the ambush point. They resolved to enlist Ivy Methvin and his truck. Ivy would be at the ambush site and pretend his truck had broken down. Bonnie and Clyde would slow down to offer help. It was then that the lawmen would spring their trap. The six-man team, composed of Texas Rangers, Hammer and Galt, Dallas deputies, Alcorn and Hinton, and Bienville lawmen Jordan and Oakley, arrived at the ambush point at 2 a.m. on May the 23rd, 1934. They left their cars further up the road and out of sight. Working by moonlight, the team brought their multiple guns into position at the ambush point and started piling branches in front of their position to obscure their little hunting party from the road. Dallas deputies Alcorn and Hinton bore the Browning automatic rifles. Hinton also had a shotgun in reserve. Sheriff Jordan went old school, arming himself with a Winchester repeating rifle. Deputy Oakley and Texas Ranger Manny Galt both had Remington 35 caliber rifles. And Frank Hammer had a heavy Colt Monitor machine rifle capable of piercing metal and a powerful Remington Model 11 shotgun capable of reducing human beings to pulp. These dudes are heavily armed, which, honestly, you need to be, because so far it's been like people with revolvers facing off against these Browning automatic rifles, which are devastating. All of the officers carried handguns for use once they'd empty the rounds from all the heavy artillery. Bob Alcorn was given a pair of binoculars and assigned to the task of confirming it was Bonnie and Clyde in the car before the lawmen started shooting. With that, the lawmen hunkered down for the night by the side of the road, being eaten alive by mosquitoes and observing venomous snakes slithering nearby. That sounds miserable. At dawn, Ivy Methvin arrived with his truck. The lawman positioned the vehicle on the road, removed the front tire, and placed the truck on a jack to suggest that Ivy had blown a wheel. With the truck positioned on the narrow road, it would be impossible for Clyde to pass it at high speed. He'd have to at least slow down to a crawl at the ambush site. The lawman instructed Ivy that when they spotted Bonnie and Clyde making their way up the road, he was to go out and stand by his truck and wave for them to stop. Ivy complained loudly and at length that this would get him killed. Sheriff Jordan growls, "If you don't shut your mouth, Barrow won't get a chance to kill you, because I'll have done it for him." At 9:15 a.m., the posse heard a car approaching. It was a Ford V8, Cordoba Grey. Alcorn looked through his binoculars and confirmed it contained Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Ivy Methvin took his position on the road. As the V8 approached the ambush position, a logging truck appeared at the opposite direction. The logging truck slowed and pulled over to the side of the road, giving Clyde a path to move around Ivy Methvin's truck and continue along to Methvin's house. Of course, Clyde had no intention of just leaving Ivy stranded on the road, and he slowed down to a stop in order to lend a hand. What followed occurred over the course of just 16 seconds. Frank Hammer was about to stand up and tell Bonnie and Clyde to surrender when Bienville Deputy Prentice Oakley lost his nerve, stood up, aimed his Remington rifle at Clyde Barrow and fired. The bullet entered through Clyde's left temple and exited through the right, killing him instantly. Oh no! His left foot fell off the brake pedal and the car began to lurch slowly towards a ditch a few yards up on the road. 2 seconds after the first shot had been fired, Hammer, Galt, Alcorn, Hinton and Jordan all stood up and unloaded on the car. Ivy hit the dirt and laid flat. The first thing they heard was Bonnie Parker scream, a sound that all 6 lawmen claimed haunted them for years afterward. In reality, they needn't have poured bullets into the car. Clyde was already dead. Bonnie would likely have surrendered, or at least would have been too upset at Clyde's sudden death to immediately grab a weapon. But during those few critical seconds, the lawmen could not be certain that Clyde was dead. All they knew was that Clyde Barrow had managed to shoot his way out of every single engagement with police, with numerous officers being killed. Thus, Bonnie Parker had to die. Yeah, fair enough. Like, every time he'd been encountered, it was like he'd have just loads of guns and he'd end up killing a bunch of cops. And so, fair play. Fair play. A downpour of machine gun, rifle, and shotgun bullets hit the car. In total, about 130 rounds were fired as the car slowly drifted past. Once it had done so, Frank Hammer left nothing to chance. He hefted his powerful Colt Monitor rifle, walked up to the car, and fired an armor-piercing shot into Bonnie through the right rear window, and then walked around to the front of the car as it came to a rest in a ditch and fired 3 more shots into Bonnie through the front windshield. Clyde Barrow had been shot 17 times, including several shots to his head that fragmented his skull and shots that severed his spinal cord. He's most definitely dead. Bonnie Parker had been shot 26 times. In her hand, she clutched not a gun, but a napkin-wrapped sandwich that she'd purchased that morning at a local cafe. Deputy Ted Hinton summed up the shooting by saying, quote, When all was said and done, they weren't nothing but a bunch of wet rags. Arcadian hyenas. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Ivy Methvin got up, started putting the wheel on his truck, and grumbled about how he just wanted to go home. 3 passengers in the logging truck approached the scene to look at what had happened. Deputy Ted Hinton took out a 16mm movie camera and filmed the bullet-riddled Ford V8. Gunsmoke was still in the air when he started filming. You could view the footage online. Neither Bonnie nor Clyde had a gun in the front seat with them. Their arsenal was in the back seat under some blankets. You could make the argument that had Oakley not lost his nerve and Hammer had a chance to tell them to surrender, maybe both Bonnie and Clyde would have been captured. I don't think so. They'd always fight their way out of things. This is unlikely though, since Clyde had no intention of being taken alive. He would likely have reached for a gun in the back seat or attempted to speed away, and the lawman would have opened up on the car anyway, killing Bonnie in the process. In short, there really wasn't a realistic scenario where one or both of them got out alive. It was an utterly stupid, juvenile waste of life. But as the kids say, around and you find out. Yes, indeed. The posse then started dividing up Bonnie and Clyde's possessions, as had been previously agreed with prison manager Lee Simmons. Frank Hammer took Clyde's arsenal of guns and his fishing tackle box. Bob Alcorn took Clyde's saxophone. Sheriff Jordan allegedly took a suitcase full of cash that was in the car without divvying it up with the other lawmen, and soon after bought a property in nearby Arcadia. Shit the past. It was like, yeah, you capture them. Spoils of war, boys. The other lawmen each took a share of the clothing. Really? Bonnie's makeup. Really? Road maps and a handful of true crime magazines that were in the car. Guys, why are you taking their junk? You just got a suitcase full of money. Hammer, Hinton, Jordan and Oakley drove to a gas station to use the phone and report what had happened. Hammer called Lee Simmons and simply said, "Well, we got them." Then Hammer covered for Oakley, saying they died with guns in their hands. Meanwhile, Bob Alcorn and Manny Galt had been left guarding the Ford and Bonnie and Clyde's corpses. People in the area had heard the gunfire and came to have a look. Word spread like wildfire that Bonnie and Clyde were dead. Soon the ambush site was flooded by dozens of people. Manny and Galt had trouble controlling the crowd. People tried to dig the bullets that had missed the car out of nearby tree trunks. One man leaned into the car and tried to cut off one of Clyde's ears. Another tried to cut off his trigger finger. Another got a lock of Bonnie's hair and tore scraps off her dress. Jesus, what was this? This section was called Hyenas. Now I know why. Jesus, guys. A tow truck came and dragged the car away with Bonnie and Clyde's bodies still inside, covered with a sheet, toward the town of Arcadia. Along the way, the tow truck broke down in front of a primary school. The kiddies came bounding out and surrounded the car, and one of them tore the sheet off Bonnie and Clyde, horrifying most of the other children with a gruesome sight. Jesus Christ. That's seriously unfortunate. By the time the tow truck pulled into Arcadia, which usually had a population of 3,000, there were 16,000 people lining the roads to look at the Ford V8 and the corpses of Bonnie and Clyde. It was slow going down Main Street toward the coroner's office, and the lawman once again said they had trouble keeping people away from the car, with multiple onlookers trying to climb inside the vehicle. One of them was surprised that the vicious Clyde Barrow was 5'6" and 125 pounds, exclaiming, "He's nothing but an itty-bitty little fart." Yeah, I forgot he was so tiny. The coroner in Arcadia did an autopsy on Bonnie and Clyde. I wonder why they had died from bullets. Yes. And Louisiana undertaker Dillard Darby, who'd been taken hostage by the Barrow gang in 1933, assisted with the embalming. At the time of his kidnapping, Bonnie had joked that Darby might work on her someday, and it turns out she was right. Do they really bother embalming people like this? I mean, I guess, is anyone going to pay for their funeral? They got family, right? I guess you have to have, some dignity for the dead. But, I don't know, just, don't they normally, I don't know, I feel like people should just be burned, just cremate them and then just put the ashes in a box. Or just throw them out. Dismembered appendices. Number 1. Henry Barrow, Clyde's father, and Buster Parker, Bonnie's brother, arrived in Arcadia late that evening to pick up the bodies. They were going to be transported separately. Emma Parker, who had fainted upon hearing the news her daughter was dead, insisted that Bonnie and Clyde could not be buried together. She hated Clyde Barrow for the fate that befell her daughter. She had as much. She was in this. She was into this. It's not she was some unknowing accomplice. She was super into this. On May the 25th, an estimated 16,000 people turned out for Clyde's funeral. One man offered Henry Barrow $10,000 for his son's body, or $230,000 in modern money. On May the 26th, 20,000 people turned out for Bonnie Parker's funeral. Within 2 days, the Dallas Daily sold 500,000 copies of their newspaper, detailing Bonnie and Clyde's deaths. Number 2. Various federal, state, and county law organizations, along with many banks and local businesses, had offered a total of $26,000 for the killing or capture of Bonnie and Clyde. Split 6 ways, this would have been $4,333 each, or $100,000 in modern money. Most of these organizations didn't come through with what they offered. In the end, the Hammer posse walked away with $200 each, or $4,600 today. That's not quite the $100,000 they were promised, was it? Hammer sold Bonnie and Clyde's arsenal of guns for an undisclosed but presumably large profit, ignoring the requests of the Barrow and Parker families to return the guns so they could use the money for themselves. They're stolen guns! They should be returned to the armory. Meanwhile, Bob Alcorn felt guilty and gave over Clyde's saxophone to the Barrow family. It was later sold. I would not feel guilty at all. I'd just be like, I'm keeping that fucking saxophone, and I'm just going to sell it on eBay, or whatever like 1930s eBay is. The Cordoba Grey Ford V8 sat in an impound lot in Arcadia. Sheriff Jordan wanted to sell it. The car had been stolen in Topeka, Kansas. The car's owner, Ruth Warren, demanded to have it back. Jordan told her she could have it for $15,000 or $345,000 in modern money. How about it's her fucking car? Ruth took him to court and won her car back. She headed down to Arcadia, and despite the fact that it had 130 bullet holes in it, the engine still ran perfectly fine. Wow, Henry Ford does make some fine cars. Warren drove the car, still filled with bloodstains and various bits of human gristle. Oh, grim. 51 miles or 82 kilometers to Shreveport, where she had it shipped up to Topeka. One of the weird, YouTube genres that I sometimes watch is people who restore cars. Like, they'll go to a junkyard, not to a junkyard, but like what's it called? Where the insurance companies dump the cars that they sell them for a little money. And on some of them, they have like biohazard warning signs, like after a crash. And it's like, oh, grim, because there's like blood in there and stuff from whatever car accident was going on. Not nice. She rented it out to Charles Stanley, the crime doctor, who took it all around the country to attract people and listen to his anti-crime lectures. The death car was later sold to a tour group, and it was taken all over North America for the next few decades as a carnival attraction. My dad saw it as a kid in Canada in the 1960s. Then the car was sold to a casino in Prim, Nevada, where it remains on display to this very day. Ruth Warren did very well to take them to court to get that car back, because I bet she made a bundle out of this. Speaking of Charles Stanley, the crime doctor, he once put on a lecture in Austin, Texas, where Frank Hammer lived. During the show, Frank Hammer and Manny Gold came on stage. Hammer shouted to the crowd, "I'm Frank Hammer," and then slapped the crime doctor across the face and told him never to do his show ever again. Stanley did not comply. Holy shit. Number 5. For his cooperation with law enforcement, Henry Methvin received a Texas governor's pardon for the attempted murder in Texas in 1930 and was not charged for the murder of Wheeler and Murphy near Grapevine on April 1st, 1934, though he should have been. Of course he should have been! What the f***? But he was arrested and convicted on the murder of Constable Campbell near Commerce, Oklahoma on the 6th of April that year and sentenced to death. They got him anyway, didn't they? At appeal, where Hammer came and spoke on his behalf, Methvin's sentence was commuted to life in prison, but even then, he was paroled after serving only 8 years. Methvin, you made out of the situation like a bandit. Who was your lawyer? In 1948, he got drunk, passed out on a railway track, and got cut in half by a train. Fuck me, I think I'd rather be put in the electric chair. Number 6. As for the other Barrow gang members, Joe Palmer was arrested on the 15th of June 1934. He was sent to Eastham, where he joined Ray Hamilton. On July the 22nd, they escaped. Palmer was recaptured in August, Hamilton the following April. They were both sent to the electric chair on May the 10th of 1935. Whoa. That's for escaping prison? Damn. William Jones was paroled from his 15-year sentence in 1939. He became a drunk and drug addict in later life. In 1974, he picked up a woman at a bar, took her home, only to get shot and killed by her jealous boyfriend. Ralph Fultz was pardoned from his sentence for kidnapping and armed robbery in 1935, only to wind up back in jail with a 50-year sentence for robbery again, being paroled in 1944. People in the past there was a lot of pardons and a lot of very short jail sentences of very serious crimes. Just to comment there, 50-year sentence, right? Robbery in 1934. He was let out 9 years later of a 50-year sentence. What changed in America? Because that's like life without parole, baby. Let's go. He became a born-again Christian, worked a series of legitimate jobs, became a public speaker about the evils of a life of crime, and died in 1993. I take it back. This guy made good. Kumi Barrow and Emma Parker both got a month in prison for harboring fugitives. Bonnie's sister, Billie Jean, got a year in prison, arguing against her being a rat. Clyde's sister, Marie, got an hour in jail. Okay. Bizarrely, or not so bizarrely, Clyde's dad, Henry Barrow, was never charged. Yeah, because he was pretty helpful in the end, right? In the shooting. Number 8. In the autumn of 1934, Ma Ferguson lost her bid for re-election as Texas governor. Shortly thereafter, the Texas Rangers were reconstituted and remain an organization for elite law enforcement to this day. In order to be a Texas Ranger, you have to have at least 8 years' experience in law enforcement, many commendations, and the waiting list to be selected for one of the few available positions is about a mile long. Frank Hammer briefly rejoined the Texas Rangers to provide security during the 1948 election, and his colleague Manny Galtry joined in 1937 and worked on the job for 10 years until his death 10 years later. Hammer lived until 1955 when he died at the age of 71. Old West bullets still inside him because you don't f*** with the Texas Rangers. Number 9. There have been 2 mainstream Hollywood depictions of Bonnie and Clyde. There have been a couple of low-budget television miniseries that never really made it on the radar. The 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, is historically inaccurate to the extreme. The motivation for the movie seems to be showing a rather attractive Dunaway near nude as much as possible and having her use various inanimate objects as symbolic penises to which she is giving fellatio. Spicy for the 1960s. The film depicts Bonnie and Clyde meeting 2 years later than they did. Their crime spree bears little resemblance to reality at all. Ivan and Blanche's story is bastardized, and they made Clyde Barrow impotent for some reason. Frank Hammer is portrayed as an incompetent buffoon, so much so that Hammer's family sued for defamation in 1971 and got an out-of-court settlement. The movie Finding Nemo is a more accurate depiction of the story of Bonnie and Clyde than the best. I just saw Bonnie and Clyde. I just saw Finding Nemo with my kids the other day. I'd never seen it before. Or I mean, I'd seen it when I was young, I think, because it was familiar. But yeah, long time since I've seen Finding Nemo. Unfortunately, this is the primary way most of the public imbibe their knowledge of Bonnie and Clyde, and it's all wrong. Horribly, horribly wrong. Yeah, I don't know why Bonnie and Clyde are romanticized, because they seem like total pieces of shit. The other mainstream Hollywood production is 2019's Highwaymen. Yes, that far apart, which barely shows Bonnie and Clyde and focuses on Frank Hammer, played by Kevin Costner, hunting down and ambushing the Outlaws. The role of Frank Hammer and Manny Gold, played by Woody Harrelson, in the killing of Bonnie and Clyde is made to look far more heroic than it actually was, with a chase scene that never happened, and Hammer in the film actually managing to say halt to Bonnie and Clyde before the lawman opened fire. Moreover, Bonnie and Clyde are depicted as more villainous than they really were. Bonnie Parker is depicted shooting a man in cold blood not once but twice, when it's doubtful she even did it once. Bonnie was a drunk and a narcissist. She wasn't a cold-blooded killer. She was an idiot, but Highwayman increases the villain aspect by taking McNabb, the man who Joe Palmer tracked down and killed for tormenting him in prison, rewriting him as a little wimp who failed to escape Easton during the jailbreak, who's released to be a rat only to get his head bashed in with a baseball bat by Clyde. So basically, it seems they take the names Bonnie and Clyde, who are outlaws, and then make up an entirely different story around it. Bottom line, no movie or television miniseries has ever really done the story justice. Where the Bonnie Parker stomping out of a Joplin garage in her 90, blasting away at 3 cops with a Browning automatic. Netflix or Amazon, I'm waiting for your phone call. We'll shoot it like a Tarantino film. It'll be great. Yeah, it would be nice to see like an actual, somewhat historically, because it's a fascinating story. They should do it just more realistically. Maybe there's a reason they don't. Maybe it's just none of the characters are likable enough. Number 11. Final points. Final points in a very, very long episode, David. Large parts of this episode regarding Hammer would not have been possible without Josh at the YouTube channel Wild West Extravaganza. I don't give history channels a plug very often, but Wild West Extravaganza is worth it. I listen to him when I'm hungover, which if you're a writer, you know is the king of compliments. It is a 28k sub channel, which deserves far more love. Josh is by far the best Wild West history channel on YouTube. That crass piece of shit would never admit it, but his methods as a historian and communicator of knowledge are top class. And I'm one of the best trained historians in the world. I know what I'm talking about. All right, go check out Wild West Extravaganza. 28k subs. How did you even discover it, David? I mean, fantastic. Let's get him some more subs. And thank you, everybody, for being here for this absolutely epic episode. You want to know a secret? I recorded this over 3 days because it was so long. You might have noticed different t-shirts, but they're all kind of the same. Different coffee cups and such things. It was a marathon. Thanks for being here. If you enjoy the show, if you enjoy these long ones, please give it a rating on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. That would be grand. Like and subscribe on YouTube, and I'll see you next time.